And we are back, everybody. Welcome back to Notre Dame's Defensive Day conversation. We're going to talk some defense today, Ryan. This is obviously the Irish Breakdown Podcast. That is Ryan Roberts. I am Brian Driscoll. And I'm talking some football today. There's a lot of recruiting stuff always going on. And, man, I keep saying this. I'm ready to talk some football. And today, Ryan, I think is a good day to talk about the Notre Dame defense. We're sitting there Tuesday, October 9th. We're a month from now. We're going to be the Friday before the home opener. You're going to be in town. I'm going to be in town getting ready to watch Notre Dame kick off their home slate. And we'll know by then kind of what happened against Ohio State in the opener on Saturday. And as you kind of think about how that game is going to play out, the reality is a lot of it is going to have to do with the Notre Dame defense. And the Notre Dame offense in that game could play really well and Notre Dame still lose. And the reason for that is because, as we have said a lot of different times, when you play the best teams, they're going to be able to score. And if you're a good defense, you're going to be able to keep the points down, but you have to be an elite defense to really get things rolling. So we are going to talk about the Notre Dame defense and just how good it can be this year. And the reality is, in order for this for this football team to reach its full potential, the offense has to play better. But the defense still has to be dominant. And it has been the unit that has carried this football team for several years now, Ryan. And a lot of the success we've seen in recent years has been because of the defense. But there's another level this defense can and needs to get to. And if that's going to happen, and it happened in the biggest games, USC at the end, Clemson in the middle, and Notre Dame or Ohio State at the beginning, this defense is going to have to raise its level of play. For that to happen, it needs its stars to play like stars. And Notre Dame has had stars on defense every year for the last several years. But the best defense they've had in the last 10 years, in my opinion, was the 2018 defense. And the difference between that defense and the ones that followed is it had more star power. You look at Jerry Tillery, where you could in each week there was a different defensive lineman playing like that, whether it was Khalid Kareem one week and Julian Okwara another week, and Julian Okwara a lot of weeks that season. Dalen Hayes stepped up and had some moments. You had Drew Tranquil, I thought, played like a star linebacker that season. You had Julian Love on the outside as a cornerback. And I would argue, although Gilman played like one of the best safeties in the country that year, Troy Pride at the end of the year was better than Julian Love was. And so to me, the more players that have that potential that reach that level this season, the better this defense is going to be. And if Notre Dame is going to make a run at a championship, which is going to have to include, wins over the teams they play in the regular season, Ohio State, Clemson, USC, BYU, this defense has to be great, and those stars have to play like stars. And it gets no bigger, brighter moment for this group than the opener against Ohio State.
Well, I feel like when we were talking about the offensive star power yesterday, it's like there's a couple extreme known commodities, and then there's a few guys that like Notre Dame needs to break out and be that type of star. I feel like Notre Dame defense, we have a lot more known commodities, right? Like there's a lot more guys right now that you're willing to say that kid is a star because I've seen it, right? Like we'll get into Foskey and Brandon Joseph and all these guys today, and we have seen star potential already to this point, but it creates a different kind of vibe for me, Brian, because it's like you have such high expectations for this defensive unit because there's such a higher floor, maybe comparative to the offense, that now you're kind of setting yourself up for I hope I don't get disappointed here, right? Because like you're counting on it that these guys are going to be stars, and there is a level up, I think, for every one of the players to be even better. But I think when you have a known commodity like this, you just have to at least hit that point, right? Because if they are all just as good as last year, like I said before, you're going to have a really good defense. Sure. But the separation factor is going to be if they play like stars from day one, September 3rd through the remainder of the season, then we're talking about a very good defense that could potentially be on an elite level. That's what I consider this point here. This is why the stars are so important for the defense this season.
And I don't think the defense has been on that level for the most part. I think at times in 2018 it was. I think especially by towards the end of the season, I think they played Clemson about as well as anybody could play Clemson when they were healthy. The depth wasn't there, which is an issue that we've talked about before. But if you're going to beat Ohio State in the opener, if you're going to have a chance in the fourth quarter to win that game, your defense is going to have to play like an elite defense. If you're going to beat Alabama in the postseason to stop Bryce Young, your defense is going to have to play at an elite level. And that's true when you look at a lot of the big-time matchups. And while Notre Dame's defense has certainly had them in competition, the only game where the defense really was able to shut down another elite team is when they played Georgia, and those Georgia offenses were never that good. They handled their business and did what they needed to do, and in both games, the defense gave the team a chance to win in the fourth quarter, and the offense couldn't get the job done. But there's another level this unit has to get to, and there's a lot of different things that need to happen, and we've talked about a lot of them. Breakout players need to emerge. You need Riley Mills to step up. Somebody's got to step up opposite Cam Hart and all those type of things. But at the end of the day, if your best players don't play their best in the biggest games, you're just not going to have a chance to win. And it's like we said yesterday. When we talk about, start of the season to finish, it doesn't mean that Isaiah Foskey has to go out and get 3 sacks every single game. They don't need him to have a monster game to beat Marshall, to beat Cal, to beat Syracuse. You don't want him to play bad, but that's just it's not practical to think that a guy's going to go out there and get 2 sacks in every game that he plays in. It's about being consistently good and then really raising your level of play when it matters most. I think that's what the great players do. And I think it has to start up front. And the way that we're going to discuss this is obviously Isaiah Foskey's part of this conversation, but you and I have had a lot of conversations about Jason Adamuola. And I'm gonna talk about Foskey, let you talk about Adamuola, because I've talked about Jason, a ton over the years, and I know you're pretty fired up about him today. But at the end of just kind of big picture, Ryan, just from a unit as a whole, the reason we throw both of them in there is because Isaiah is the proven star. Jason is the ascending one in our view. They need both of them to really be this way, because you're going to need that inside-out presence this season to where, you can't just take Isaiah Foskey out of the game. And somebody else has to step up. And to me, Jason is the player that has the experience, the talent, the athleticism, the mindset to be that guy. And he showed flashes of it last year. This year, he has to continue that in the big games, but even bring more consistency. But this duo has to be dominant, because all the other positions, Riley Mills and all their lives are made easier if this duo steps up and plays at an elite level this season, especially in the big games. And so it has to start with Isaiah Foskey and Jason Adamuola.
I think it's said perfectly, because the key thing that you said there that I could not agree with more is that we expect Riley Mills to also be a breakout player this year, but budding star potentially in the future. But if Riley Mills does not hit his ceiling this year, he still has more eligibility, right? Like, this isn't like the end all last chance type of situation. For Jason Adamuola, who we saw incredible flashes of last year, this is his final year. And the experience factor is the biggest thing for me, because everyone and their mother offensively is going to say, number 7, nope, not gonna stop us. We'll run away from him. We're gonna keep tight ends in the chip. We're gonna keep slide protection to his side. We're gonna make sure that Isaiah Foskey is not the game wrecker. How do you stop that from being the game plan? Have another player to step up and be the guy, right? And I think that can be Jason Adamuola, because Brian, we saw it 2 years ago, even when he was just a part-time player with Alabama, right? Like, he dominated that football game. And I think that you kind of got a little of a sample size of just how dominant he can be. And then last year, you put on a given game and you'll get 3 to 4 flashes a game of, like, I think of the USC game again, where like he's just long arm in the right tackle and finishing a sack on the first play of the game.
Right.
Like, those moments happened a lot last year, but it wasn't on like a snap to snap, drive to drive basis. If it is, I would contend that Jason Adamuola could be the most, he's already the most underrated defensive tackle in college football, in my opinion. But I think that he could be a riser in the national perspective, because nobody gives him the recognition right now. Right. It's all Isaiah Foskey, even though there were flashes last year where Jason Adamuola was one of the better defensive tackles in college football. Right. That's what the best of him is. And if they're able to get that, if he's able to create that type of production, right, and to get that type of attention, then that's only going to make Isaiah Foskey even better. Because he's going to have one-on-one opportunities in that situation.
Now, keep in mind that Jason had about 80 more pass rushes than Isaiah did last year, because they weren't dropping him into coverage. But Isaiah Foskey did not lead the defense in pressures last season, according to Pro Football Focus. Jason did. He had 43. He had 13 hits on the quarterback. Isaiah had 15. That's really good production from an interior guy. And is there a level that he needs to get to? Yeah. Well, consider this. The year that Jerry Tillery was an All-American, he had 49 pressures that season on 413 pass rushes, and he had 15 hits on the quarterback. 413 pass rushes, 49 pressures. Jason Adamuola last year had 43 pass pressures on 369 pass rushes and 13 hits on the quarterback.
Yep.
And Jerry Tillery was an All-American that season and turned himself into a first-round draft pick. So, when you look at the production has been there. And I think that is something that when I look at it, he has a chance to be a really special player. And he's got some areas of his game that I think have to continue to get better. But here's another part of it. I would argue that he was a better all-around player last season than Jerry Tillery was in 2018. And again, I just showed the pass rush numbers, which were very, very similar. Jerry Tillery in 2018 during his All-American season had 20 run stops, according to Pro Football Focus. Jason last year had 29.
Yeah.
And so, and he did that on 223 defensive plays against the run. Jerry had 251. So Jason had fewer pass rushes attempts, fewer run play attempts, and was significantly more productive in the run game. And on a per snap basis, right there with Jerry Tillery on a pass rush standpoint. And he gets none of the love that Jerry had. And here's the reason why. What was the one game we can all point to when you look at Jerry Tillery in 2018?
Stanford.
It was two top 10 teams. Now Stanford ended up not being that good, but at the time when pollsters and voters and fans and media people are watching that game, it was number 6 versus number 7.
Yep.
I believe it was 6 or 7 or 7 versus 8. It was something like that. It was a highly ranked game. Jerry went out there and dominated, had like 3 or 4 sacks in that game, just dominated Stanford, and Notre Dame rolls. It was a night game. It was a top 10 matchups, and Jerry was at his best. And to me, that's got to be Jason this year, because what Jerry did that year is he didn't actually have as many, to me, impactful pressures, but when he got to the quarterback went down.
Finished. Yeah.
And Jason was more, I would argue, a little bit more disruptive last year than Jerry was, but Jason's got to finish better this year. And that's the big thing. And I think that's the thing that hurts his reputation. Number one, there's a stigma about his size. Oh, he's only 6'2.5". He's only 280 pounds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
But he's got to finish better because the numbers don't flash at you. It was like 7 tackles for loss last year, 3.5 sacks. Those don't, to me, do justice just how disruptive he was last year. But that's because he's got to finish better. And if he can finish better, then the numbers will be there and people will start to give him the respect that his game is due, because he's a really disruptive player. And if him and Foskey are – and here's the other thing about last year. It didn't seem like there was a lot of times where they were both dominant in the same game.
That's fair.
And, they were both good usually. I can't think of a game last year that Jason wasn't at least good. And I can't think of a game last year where Isaiah wasn't at least good. And, for what he could do, and, defense, offenses are, game planning for him, whatever, but they at least played good football every game. What we didn't see a lot of, I think maybe USC, but even then it was a little bit flashy. There were flashy plays from both of them. There weren't a lot of games last year where I thought both of them just like, wow, these two are dominant in the same game. And maybe there's one, and I'll remember when we get off the show, like, oh, hey, remember that one game? But it just didn't seem that way to me. And I think that's going to be the thing that we need to see this year. And why we're putting them together is they both have to be that dude. If Isaiah has a great game against Ohio State and the rest of the D-line doesn't, they're not going to be able to stop Ohio State. If Jason has a great game against Ohio State and the rest of the defensive line doesn't, then they're not going to be able to get there. And I think the Alabama game that you point to is a perfect example. I thought the Notre Dame defensive line held their own against Alabama. They really did. The problem was none of them played to Jason's level. Nobody else played to Jason's level. And that's got to change. And that's going to be the key to me is against Ohio State, it's got to be Jason and Isaiah. Against Clemson, it's got to be Jason and Isaiah. Against USC, Alabama, whoever else you play that's got sort of a high-octane offense, they need to both play well. And I think it starts there. If they play well, then it makes everything else easier on the rest of the D-line, and then especially on the second and third level players and on the perimeter players.
Something that I also think hurts, and Jason Adamuola, and you mentioned it already a little bit, Brian, is I think the film guys really appreciate Jason Adamuola because of the things that he does and the production the production that's a little hidden in his tape, right? The havoc that he causes and the penetration, and it's easy to see on film. But then the analytics guys, and I'm not trying to throw shade at analytics because I use some analytics, but they're going to look at the box score, they're going to look at the height, weight, and they're going to be like, man, he's just a solid player, right? Like he's not a great football player. But when you watch the film, it's a much, much different story, in my opinion. And I agree with you. People have asked me a lot this offseason, how can Isaiah Foskey go from a potential first-round pick to a top 10 pick, playing big in those big games, right? The one thing you'll give to Aiden Hutchinson, although Ohio State's offensive line was not good, there was perception there, right? He had a good game in a big moment, and that is a part of the reason why Aiden Hutchinson buoyed up to number 2 overall pick, aside of just having the production he had, right? So those big moments, I think, are paramount for this duo to be what they can be this year.
It's not about, oh, he played against a really good offensive line that game. It's about the moment. And I think that's the thing about the comparison to Aiden Hutchinson is Ohio State's offensive line wasn't great last year, but it wasn't bad. It wasn't like Virginia's offensive line or something like, I mean, it was a solid offensive line, a little overrated, but still good, I think, for the most part. And he dominated it. But it was more of the game was big. The moment was big. It was an offense that could go out there and score. And the only way you could stop him from scoring was to disrupt the quarterback. And that was a key for that game. And it was really the same thing for Oregon as Ohio State got their yards against Oregon, but they were disruptive up front. And they didn't even play to the level that Michigan's defensive line played in that game. And so you look at it, there's going to have to be the consistent production from the front in that game. And it has to be Jason and Isaiah together. It doesn't mean they're going to both get to the quarterback on every single play. That's not going to happen. It's just about both of them playing at a high level in that game and against the run and the pass, because I think that's a part of Jason's game to me that is very underrated. Agreed. I think a lot of people focus on Jason's pass rush because that there's the assumption because of size, the measurables, that, oh, he's athletic and he's really good at block destruction and he's undersized. So, pass rusher. But what you don't often understand is Jason's been a really disruptive run defender for most of his career. And there's been at least 2 seasons that I can remember where if you look at the run stop percentage on a kind of a per play basis, Jason is graded out as Notre Dame's best run defender. And he's again, last year, I think Isaiah Foskey led the defense with 35 run stops. Jason was next with 29 as an interior guy. And they were pretty equal on the snap standpoint on both. So Isaiah at times is great against the run. And other times his technique would lag. Again, first year in the starting lineup. I think that's another thing is for as maybe inconsistent, maybe at times as he was with his technique or angles or leverage or whatever in the run game, he was still really productive against it, effective against the run.
Sure.
Now that he's in year 2, I think that's the part of his game that maybe doesn't get the sexy, discussion because he's an edge player. It's going to be about the sacks. He's got a chance to break the sack record and all that. But if he's going to really be dominant, the first thing he can do against Ohio State is make sure there's no way TreVeyon Henderson's running on this side of the field. And that goes into being a great player, because if you have a great game against Ohio State in the past, you're going to have 2 sacks, right? Well, they're going to throw the ball 40 plus times. That's fine. But what are you doing those other plays when you're not getting a sack? Are you getting a pass rush? Are you making the quarterback uncomfortable? What about, are you forcing them to pass the ball more by stopping the run, setting the edge, making them right-handed or, just kind of opposite-handed? Hey, you can't run at me. So because the reason that's important is because they're going to put numbers at Isaiah to protect against the pass. If they can, but then they're going to use that to run at him. That's another way to stop a great pass rusher, is to run at him. They're going to run at him. He needs to make him pay for that. Right. And those are ways where early in the game, him and Jason being on the same side of the field, if they can shut down that run defense, that run game in Ohio State and make them have to kind of go opposite, well, then Al Golden's going to have answers for that too. And so those are the things that it won't get as much attention because it's not the sexy aspect of the game like sacks and pass rushes, but it's going to be every bit as important, if not a little bit more so, against teams like Ohio State and Alabama, Clemson, than even the pass rush, because that's something you can do every single snap. And, so again, this duo has to be really good against that if they're going to come out this year and really play like stars and carry this defense to the next level.
I think the most exciting part about Isaiah Foskey, in my opinion, is that he's nowhere near a finished product, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like from a technical perspective.
Based on what we saw last year, right?
Yeah. Based upon last year, he wins right now with being super long and explosive. But like there's not a ton of moves in the arsenal. His technique is not perfect from a snap-to-snap basis. This is still a pretty raw football player, at least from last season, which tells me, buddy, you just had 10 or 11 sacks as a raw football player just off of talent.
Yeah,
like,
two moves.
Imagine when it clicks.
In the long arm. That's
right,
it.
Seriously.
That's all he had.
Like he gets a cross chop in his arsenal. He gets an inside counter. And then, like, how do you stop Isaiah Foskey at that point? You can't. Even when you're double teaming him sometimes, it's just going to be like, I still can't stop him. He's just going to be able to slip through because he's so long and he's so explosive. So that's why I have such a high expectation of Isaiah Foskey. It's because people, I think, are just like assuming last year is the version of Isaiah Foskey. In my mind, I think he's going to be much better. Like, I think that he has a chance to be one of the best defensive ends that have come through Notre Dame in some time. Like, I think he has that type of upside to him. If he hasn't already kind of pushed his way into that conversation just based on his raw traits. So I'm excited about that one, Brian. And I'll also say for Jason, I think that Jason has a great opportunity to go from underappreciated to appreciated very quickly. And that starts with Ohio State. And a big thing for me, we've talked about this a little bit before, I think if Notre Dame, in order to get pressure, especially in that first game, and I know we'll go more in depth of Ohio State leading up to the game, but especially in that game where I think if you have to bring 5 or sometimes even 6 to get pressure on CJ Stroud, I think that is not a good thing. No. That is very telling that your dudes, exactly, your dudes are not getting home, right? For them to be super successful in that game, if they need to get home with 4, like they need to, and for them to get home with 4 consistently, you need those 2 to be the guys. Right. And to your point, to begin with, though, I think Ohio State is going to try to run the football on you because they have TreVeyon Henderson, and I think they understood that they did not run the ball to as good as they probably could have last year, at least the emphasis upon it. So I think they're going to try that, and for that to happen, for Notre Dame to get them into the inopportune possessions of 2nd and 9, 3rd and 8, whatever it might be, you need to be able to stop the run. And I think that they also present that type of upside. But I am just really excited because I don't think we've seen the best of Isaiah Foskey, and I don't think we've seen the finishing of potential that Jason Adamuola has. If both those guys put it together, this could threaten to be in one of the top defensive lines of college football. I mean, it's going to be hard to beat like a Clemson, for instance, but why can't Notre Dame finish with the 2nd or 3rd best defensive line in college football next year? I don't see any reason that that's not possible.
Right. I want to kind of harken back a little bit to the run game aspect of it too, Ryan, because I do think that it's not just the pass game that it needs to be impacted by the front 4 alone. It needs to be the run game as well. And I think that's something that was lacking in several years. Like Jerry Tillery, great pass rusher, not a great run defender. And there's reasons for it. He's really tall. Leverage was a little bit more challenging for him at times and things along those lines. And there's other reasons for it, but you look at the production that Jerry Tillery had last year, or excuse me, that Isaiah Foskey had last year. It really was kind of spectacular if you really want to break it down and look at the numbers. And for example, do you remember the year that Raekwon Davis had that monster season at Alabama? It was I think 2017 year they won the title.
Wasn't that his sophomore year, and then he just wasn't as productive?
Fell off
the
the cliff.
2?
Yeah. He led the Alabama defense that year with 35 run stops. Notre Dame's best. So, and again, what we said about Pro Football Focus: terrible grades, terrible analysis, great data collection, in my opinion.
100%.
But you look at Notre Dame's run defense from its defensive lines. Isaac Rochelle has the most run stops that a Notre Dame defensive lineman has had in this era, is the 37. The next highest was Julian Ekwar with 26. Now, Isaac Rochelle had 37 run stops on 399 run defensive plays. Last year, Isaiah Foskey played in 210 run snaps. 210, so that's 189 fewer than Isaac Rochelle. He had 35 run stops last year, which is a really outstanding number. And he led the Notre Dame defense. You don't often see defensive linemen leading defenses in run stops. It's normally linebackers. And so I think that's the thing is, again, Ryan, there was a lot of things technically about his game against the run that need to get better.
Sure.
But what helped him last year was he was just so much better and more talented than everybody he played against last year. And so that's the key for him is the competition is going to be upped this year. There's, to me, better lines and better offenses on the schedule this year, and also better quarterback play on the schedule this year. And so he can't just repeat last year's season and carry the defense the way he needs to, right? If he just repeats last year's season and Jason and Cam and Brandon and those guys repeat last year's season, Notre Dame's going to still be really good on defense. And they're going to be a 10 or 11 win team. But at the end of the day, in the big game, the Ohio State game, the postseason game, it's going to be more of the same. Good, but just not good enough. He needs to take his game to another level. And I would like to see his production up a little bit more from a tackles for loss standpoint. I'm actually okay if his sacks don't get any higher. I mean, look, he gets 10 sacks this year. I'm a happy guy. Sure. I would just like last year was like, 11 sacks, and I think it was like 12 and a half tackles for loss or 12 tackles for loss. He was really good at setting the edge and making plays at the line and things along those lines. But I want to see him be even more disruptive in the backfield, or to the point where maybe you are so like, God, we just can't block this guy, that you then force teams to run right at Riley Mills. I mean, that's a win for Notre Dame if you're forcing people to run at Riley Mills. Number one, there's going to be more guys on that side of the field. It's not going to just be Riley Mills. But number two is, force teams to run at your 293-pound defensive end.
Yes.
It's a good strategy if you're Notre Dame, right? And so, those are the things where if he can be that kind of player, because I think teams definitely game planned against Isaiah last year as we went into the season, and people quickly found out that, you got to block that guy. Mm-hmm. I don't remember noticing a lot of teams focusing their run game away from Isaiah Foskey. I think they ended up paying for that a little bit, because I think he's pretty good against the run. And when Notre Dame's run defense was really good in late October, November, and the only success teams could really have on him was quarterback scrambles. Like North Carolina had one of the most misleading 200-some rush yards I've seen, because it had like one long run on an outside run, and then the rest was quarterback scrambles. Mm-hmm. Other than that, North Carolina couldn't really do anything in the run game against Notre Dame. And we saw a similar thing against Oklahoma State, is that stats were padded by some scrambles. That's got to improve. But if you can force teams to just kind of game plan away from you, no matter what they're doing, it's so advantageous for the defense. And that's an area where his production can kind of get upped and improved this season. And that's something that you really want to see from him. And the same thing is true for Jason Adamuola, right? And a lot of times those two are going to be on the same side of the field. And that's what makes it even more important.
If they're playing so well on the front side of runs that the other teams are like, all right, we got to run away from 7 and 57. That also plays into your result too, Brian, because both those guys can work in pursuit, man. Like, they are really good athletes, like explosive in a line, right? So it's one of those things where the best of Isaiah Foskey, in my opinion, whether it's on the front side or the back side of runs, he can make plays because he's got that quite of athleticism. And Jason Adamuola is the same. There is a perception, I think, that Jason Adamuola is not a good run defender, to your point earlier. But I think that the 280 or whatever his listed is, I saw him at like 276 in the spring or whatever it was. Like, it's so misleading, man, because find me many defensive tackles in college football that have heavier hands than Jason Adamuola. Like, he shocks dudes at the point of attack. So, yes, get them to run away from you, and then use your athleticism to work in support in a pursuit perspective, and then your tackle for loss numbers, to your point, that's going to only improve if you're working in pursuit of time. And let's say a Riley Mills is holding the point on the other side of the line of scrimmage. So this is going to be an interesting conversation to just start with, especially in the run game perspective, because I agree. The best way to stop a premier pass rusher is to run at him, right? To kind of slow him down in the tracks a little bit. But eventually, if you're able to really dominate the run game, then that is just going to open up so many possibilities. Working in pursuits, just kind of to control the line of scrimmage in your favor. I think the upside is tremendous with those guys. And that's only giving credit, obviously, to how great those players are. It's also early on going to unlock guys like Riley Mills and Howard Cross and Jacob Lacey, because there's going to be a lot of advantageous situations for those guys. But the key for this defense line to be best possible is that you're good across the board. So now you also can't set your sights just fully on number 7. That's where the peak of this defensive line can be, when guys across the board are taking pressure off one of each other.
Right. Let's move on to the back end, because I think that's kind of where it starts when we talk about the stars, so to speak, of this football team, especially the established ones. There's not an established star linebacker, so we're going to kind of round things out with linebacker. I do believe Notre Dame has an established star in the back end, and that is obviously Brandon Joseph. I mean, you're talking about a kid who's got a consensus All-American. I mean, there's I think only one consensus All-American on the roster, and he's it. So, you talk about a guy that had a great season 2 years ago, who's gone against an Ohio State team that played for the national championship, when he faced against them in the Big Ten title game, and was part of really shutting down that offense better than anybody in the country did that year, including Alabama. And he had that great interception last year. I felt like he kind of tried to do too much. Number one, he had to prove he was an All-American. Number two, he didn't have Greg Newsome and some of those other defenders on the team, and he had to kind of step up and try to play outside of his game. They tried to use him more like Notre Dame used Kyle Hamilton, when that's not really his game. He won't have to be that guy at Notre Dame. I think they're going to allow him to kind of play to his game, which is more coverage. He's a good run defender, but he's not like the missile that Kyle Hamilton was. They're different players. This is a guy that can cover in the slot, that can play over top of the defense, that can be instinctive, that can make checks, can do all the different things you need him to do, play field, play boundary, play over the top, all that those different things. The reality is he's got to play like a star. Now, we've heard in the spring that he was a dude. I mean, I had 2 different sources that don't know each other tell me, he's like, I swear I've been at every practice, and that guy has at least a couple interceptions every practice. And I was like, well, that doesn't say a lot about the quarterback. Like, no, you don't understand. Like, it's how well he's playing, whether it's him being in the right spot on the tipped pass, or him step in front of something, or him baiting a quarterback, all those different things that you want him to do that he's going to then be able to do to other teams' quarterbacks. And it's going to make the Notre Dame quarterbacks better, because they're facing an All-American safety every day. And I think that's a big part of it as well. So he's been that guy in practice. Now we need to see him step up and be that guy in games. And again, it's going to have to start in the opener against Ohio State, but it can't just be him. The secondary needs, to me, both him and Cam Hart to step up. And we're going to kind of talk in pairs today, because again, you can't win the big games. This is what we're talking about, right? It's you can beat Stanford if only one of them plays above good, right? Sure. You can beat 9 out of the teams on your schedule, maybe 10, but to beat Ohio State, to beat Clemson, to beat USC, if they're what people say they are, to beat Alabama, to beat Georgia, to beat those teams, Brandon Joseph and Cam Hart have to be dynamic, and they have to be consistently dynamic if they're going to be that football team. And, it makes things a lot easier if you get both of those kids playing to their potential this season.
It's not extremely difficult to avoid one player in the secondary, right? Because you think of a cornerback shutting down half the field, quote unquote, even though that's a little bit of hyperbole just by a natural sense. But if you have now 2 different players in the secondary that are playing on a elite All-American type level, in a Cam Hart and a Brandon Joseph potentially, then it's really hard to avoid that many guys, right? 2 guys in the secondary. And then, at that point, your other players are going to have a lot of opportunities. I think that's the biggest thing for me, Brian, is you're shutting down options, right? If Cam Hart's playing at his best football, I don't expect him to get tested too often. I don't expect the ball to go his way, but that just limits part of the field that a quarterback can take advantage of. If Brandon Joseph's on the back end and he is just making plays, ranging over top, working from depth, intercepting passes, if he's doing that type of thing to that high of a level, then you're also going to kind of be like, oh, I might need to avoid that part of the field as well. If you have 2 parts of the field, at some point, there's not much spots that you can go to. And if Notre Dame just has good players at the other spots, then this is a potentially elite secondary for a position group, in my opinion, that has the most uncertainty to it in just kind of going into the year. There's a lot of people that I believe look at the cornerback opposite of Cam Hart, and they say I'm still unsure about that player. The safety spot opposite of Brandon Joseph, I'm still unsure about that player. That could be, and in that first game especially, I know we keep coming back to the Ohio State game, but with so many great pass catchers in that game, that's what has people worried. And I get it. I totally understand it. So, but I think the point of it is, Brian, is that you have 2 guys that could potentially be difference makers in the secondary. Guys that can turn the football over, that can eliminate options for a passing attack. There was high upside in that secondary. And I think that people just have a little bit of a misnomer that there is not in that department.
Right. You and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday. I think, again, I think a lot of it has to do understandably with the bowl game. And people are going to have a hard time watching that game. Be like, yeah, this is a good secondary. Is it a great secondary? No. But it's a good secondary. And I understand it. I get it. I watched the same game you did. I was there in the stands right there with you, and it was bad. My only thing is, but was that happening consistently? No, not really. And I think that's the thing that we have to figure out. Look, guys got to play better, right? Clarence Lewis has got to play better. Tariq Bracy's got to play better. All the other safeties not named Brandon Joseph have to play better. Everybody's got to play better. Cam Hart's got to play better. But the point here is that it takes the pressure off them again if Cam Hart and Brandon Joseph are playing to their level. And for Cam Hart, look, the notion of like a lockdown corner it can be oftentimes misused, in my opinion. If you really understand like what a lockdown corner was like in my generation, it was literally Deion Sanders just was going to take a guy out of the game. I mean, just sorry, you're not going to catch a pass today unless I let you. You know, and that's just the reality of it. That player, those guys aren't. You just don't see that a whole lot. And so for me, when I look at it, you still need to be able to have a guy though that you can say, hey, we feel like we can put this guy on that guy, and he's going to win the battle. That guy's going to make his plays, but we're going to make it really hard on them for that guy to get his production. And that's what Cam Hart needs to be. And he wasn't last year, in my opinion. I don't know if there was the trust in him necessarily to say, hey, we're going to put you on so-and-so and say, hey, man, we're trusting you to go win this battle. And I think that's where his game's got to grow. And I think Cam, as a again, first year in the starting lineup, didn't play a lot of football at corner. I think it took him some time to kind of get that level. I mean, we saw him. He was kind of okay against Purdue. Had some really good plays against Purdue and some really not great plays against Purdue. Didn't play the ball great. I think the Wisconsin game was kind of the one he really broke out because he did make those plays, and we saw a more aggressive Cam Hart the rest of the season. But also we saw Cam Hart that would be prone to lapses in consistency or focus. You know, and just being able to answer that bell every single snap. Those are the things that you see from him. You say, okay, in year two, now that you have that experience, this is where we expect you to take your game. And that's kind of why I'm excited about Cam Hart this year, because from everything I've been told, you know, from all my different sources going back to beginning of the offseason, is the work is getting put in. I mean, he is motivated and hungry for a host of reasons this year. And so when you hear that, you're like, okay, take that now, put it into the field to where you're more consistent with your ability to go out there and make plays and attack and be productive, or to the point where you're just so good that teams are just like, you know what, we're not going to play him. You know, we're going to put, and there's two ways to look at it. One is like, so Ohio State, let's say Jackson Smith and Jigba still playing in the slot again this year. I think he's going to play more outside. That's just my prediction, just on seeing the evolution of how that offense could go, what he can do.
He can't play more in the slot than he did last year. It was like 90-something%. So,
no. But I think he's going to play a decent amount more outside. But the two things you look at say, okay, well, what is your philosophy if you're Notre Dame? Are you going to be in a situation, Ryan, where you say, hey, we're going to put Cam on Jackson Smith and Jigba and say, hey, man, go win that battle? Or do you say, hey, we're going to put you here and you're just going to take that part of the field away, and then we'll handle Jackson with numbers? You know, I think there's different ways to do it. Both work. I'm curious to see what Notre Dame is going to do, but that requires Cam Hart to be able to say, if you're going to get put on that number two guy, because it's like, we're going to put our number one on your number two and take your number two out of the game. And then we'll put these two on your number one and take him out of it, right? And have success there. He's got to be able to do that. He's got to be able to say, dude, sorry, you're not, you're beneath me. You know what I mean? Like, you're not Jack Smith and Jig, but you have no chance against me. You know, so can he take Marvin Harrison out of the game? You know, can he take Emeka Egbuka, I think is how you say his name. I hope I'm not disrespecting him by saying his name incorrectly. Can he take him out of the game? You know, and those are the questions that he has. And then let Al Golden worry about Jackson Smith and Jigba. You know what I mean? And so that's going to be the key for Cam. That's where, I mean, even Isaiah Foskey has to take his game to another level, but it's going to be from like here to here. I think Cam has a chance to go from like here to here. That's going to be the key. And it's going to come down to consistency the consistency aspect of it, right? Be the best version of what we saw last year. Because again, with Cam and with Jason, who I think are less established stars than Isaiah, it's more about they were flashy. Isaiah was good, really good all season, like really good. Now it's about become elite. That's the key for Isaiah. With Jason and Marist and Cam, it was you were really good last year at times.
Yes.
Now you need to be really good all the time. And that's going to be the key for Cam. And that's what made Brandon Joseph so good in 2020 is he was just the same guy every game right where he needed to be, knew the defense, got to where he needed to get to. And it wasn't just the 6 interceptions. It was him jumping a dig route and just making the quarterback go somewhere else.
Yes.
Him undercutting a corner route when the quarterback thought he's going to be able to throw it out on the flat. And then, he takes it away after the break, because the reason that's important is if that guy, if you kind of take it away early and that guy before the break, that guy can see you're moving, he goes high. Or if you stay high, then that guy sees your break, he's going to then go low. What Brandon had a knack of, in my opinion, was kind of jumping it post break, which is really effective. And so if he can do those things, which I expect him to be, he's going to be really, really good. If you can then get Cam, then that makes it special. And if Notre Dame continues to leave Cam to the field, Ryan, the interesting thing is you're going to then have your 2 dudes at defensive back for the most part on opposite sides of the field, which is interesting because my thought is put Cam to the boundary and Brandon's sort of the boundary safety, although it's interchangeable. But then you have your 4 dudes on one side of the field, and you can shut down that half of the field. And then, you can then win with numbers to the other side of the field. And then you could actually argue all 5 of your dudes are going to be on that side when we talk about Marist in a second. That's going to be the interesting decision. Or do you want to have dudes on both sides of the field? There's merit to both of those arguments, Ryan. And that's one of the things I'm very curious to see from Al Golden this year and his staff is they decide we're going to just take these 5 and completely shut down this side of the field. And then we have an extra numbers over here. Or are they going to want to maybe put at least one of those guys, and it's easier to put Cam there, or do you put your 3 dudes, we're going to get to Marist in a second, in the boundary, and then you put Cam and Brandon both to the field.
Yeah.
And then you can use numbers on the back end to help your boundary guy if you need to. There's a lot of different angles they're going to go, but at the end of the day, no matter what they decide to do, it's going to have to be done because we're trying to figure out as a staff how to best utilize our stars. And that's going to be the key because, again, it requires them to play like stars.
And the interesting part of that conversation for me, Brian, is like I'm usually let's spread out the wealth a little bit, right? Like I don't want to put everybody on the same side of the field because then you're putting the other half in some bad situations usually, right? But I think it really does depend on just what the progress that guys like Riley Mills make, right? What the other safety position looks like, what the other cornerback spot. If those players are playing good football, then I am not against trying to just make a strength even stronger, right? Like I am fully on board with that ideology. For me, just kind of backtracking the Cam Hart for a second, right? I agree with something that you said that it's like Isaiah Foskey has a chance to go from a really good football player to a great football player, right? Like there's still a steady jump, but it is a significant jump. Cam Hart can go from a good football player to an elite football player. Like that's the type of jump. He has more progress to be made because, like Isaiah, similarly, 1-year starter at a position that's still foreign to him. Isaiah obviously has been playing it a couple years longer than Cam has because, Isaiah started playing defensive end as soon as he got to Notre Dame. Cam made that transition a little later, into the sophomore year or whatever. But I think for me, Cam Hart last year, I felt like when he trusts what he saw, and I think about that Wisconsin game, being able to like jump that inside breaking routes, when he trusted what he saw, he's really good, man, because he's long and he's super athletic and he moves incredibly well in short spaces for a guy as long as he is. But the thing that I'm looking for him, not even as much from a technical upside, because technique can always get better for sure. But for me, it's just him. I want him to be comfortable. If he starts feeling more and more comfortable and just trust his instincts, because I do think there's some natural instincts there. I really do. There's some times where I'm just like, he sees it. He's seasoned.
That's the only reason he was successful last year, Ryan. Is because
100%.
he's athletic and he has a natural feel for the game. It wasn't because he was this seasoned, grizzled vet who's been playing corner his whole life. I mean, he played corner in high school, but he would just line up and press man and just be like, I'm bigger and faster than you.
I'm going to beat you up. Yeah.
That's it. That was
right,
it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, and obviously I'm sure the wide receiver background has kind of helped that instinctive nature of just trying to see like how things are going to develop in front of you and what's coming at you. And, you cut down your split, what's coming at you, you open up your split a little bit. Like there's a bunch of nuance to that conversation. But for me, if Cam Hart starts trusting himself, his abilities even more, then that's when we're talking about him being a great football player, because everything is there and there's more than enough natural instinct. It's just at times last year, I felt like he didn't trust what he was looking at all the time. If he does, then he has the potential to be that number one corner, right? Like he has the opportunity to completely take it, well, maybe not completely take a guy out, but limit the impact of a star wide receiver. That's what he has. So I feel like I have a pretty good baseline of Brandon Joseph. Like I think Brandon Joseph is going to be very good, but I wouldn't say that his ceiling is amazingly high. Like I think he's going to be a really good college football player, obviously, because he has been already, in my opinion. But Cam Hart, I think the best of Cam Hart could even be better than what Brandon Joseph is, right? So I'm just looking at him and I'm just saying he is the real key for me, because if Cam Hart plays to his upside, then you have the opportunity to take a guy out of the football game. You talk about Jackson Smith and Jigba, Marvin Harrison, Emeka, Julian Fleming, all those guys, fantastic. But if you were able to eliminate one of those players' productions and make it just 2 to 3 guys instead of 3 to 4 guys, that is a big, big opportunity in that football game specifically. So I'm most excited out of everyone that we're talking about today. I think I'm most excited to see the progress of Cam Hart, because I think that he has potentially the biggest boost in his outcome this year.
I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to make a statement that I believe to be true, and you tell me if you agree or disagree with it. I believe that if they both reach their full potential this year, Cam Hart's the best defensive back on the team. For 2 reasons. I think he's more athletic, and that's saying a lot, because I think Brandon Joseph is good at. He was actually more athletic in the spring than I thought he was going to be. He's a good athlete, but it's more about Cam is. I don't think Notre Dame fans understand just how smooth and fast Cam Hart is. And if you want evidence, go watch him. Just this is Kyle Hamilton. This was Cam Hart against Florida State, and that's how it ended. I mean, it was like he smoked him. And we've heard consistently that Cam Hart's a legitimate 4-4 guy. In the testings that Notre Dame does. It's also that I just think he's just a more dynamic all-around player when he's on. So I think if he can reach his full potential, he's their best defensive back. And if there's a scenario in which Brandon Joseph is not your best defensive back, you're going to have a really good secondary. There's no question about it. So agree or disagree on that sentiment, Ryan?
No, I agree 100%. I mean, I love Brandon Joseph. Like, the minute they got him, I'm like, oh, boy.
I mean, I was in Phoenix, just so I was in Phoenix after the bowl game, and I'm down there with my dad and my nephew, and we're driving around. I can't remember where we're going. I think we're going to go-karts or something, and Ryan was like, this is right when Brandon Joseph announced he was in the portal, and Ryan says, like, I would love it if Notre Dame went after this guy. Yep. This guy's really good. And I was like, I'll have to, check him out. And I mean, so like the minute he jumped in the portal, Ryan was like, Notre Dame's got to go after this guy. So yes, Ryan, you have definitely been on him before. We knew that Notre Dame, because my response was like, yeah, he's an undergrad. Is he an undergrad or is he a graduate? We weren't really sure, because if he's an undergrad, It's not happening. But it's like, it's Northwestern, dude. How good could he be? Because I hadn't watched him a ton. So that was kind of my response to it. But yeah, Ryan's been riding the Brandon Joseph train from like the minute he jumped in the portal. No question.
Last preseason, I had him in a first-round mock draft, like to just kind of speak to how good I think he is. Like, I really thought that he had a chance to go late first or early second round last year. Of course, he had a bit of an uneven season, right? Like, he has to get back to playing within himself, and you mentioned that, right? Like, not trying to do too much, because I think when he's kind of a Jetsy Bates-ish type of player. If you've seen him play for Cincinnati, like, just let him play from depth, man, and just let his instincts take over. He's going to be in the right spot more often than not. He's going to make plays. Is he the most dynamic athlete of all time? I would say no. I think he's a smooth, good athlete. That's fine. But to your point, Cam Hart has he's going to have and I know he already does kind of. NFL scouts are going to be drooling over him because he's
Mm-hmm.
legitimately 6'2 plus with 32 plus inch arms and is going to run potentially in the 4.4s. Like that is a height, weight, speed dynamo at the cornerback position. So I agree 100%. The best of Cam Hart, I think, can be a better player than Brandon Joseph. Maybe not a more impactful player because there is a difference there, right? There is a difference because it's easier to avoid a cornerback than it is a safety sometimes. You can kind of scheme safeties up a little bit more where like you can play robber coverages, you can play different types of, deep safety alignments. You can do different things to kind of get safeties involved sometimes, or at least roll them down close to the line of scrimmage, get them involved in the run game if you wanted to. But I really do think that Cam Hart has the upside of being one of the best corners in college football. And if he is that, then Notre Dame's in a good spot. They're in a very good spot at that point.
I was surprised at how you had mentioned smooth because when I watched Brandon on film last year, I thought he was a little tight. Like just this, and again, I think a lot of it was because his technique got away from him because he was just trying to do too much. That was the part about what I saw from him in the spring that surprised me, Ryan, was just how he's this because you said smooth. And when I first started watching film of Brandon in 2020, because I went 2021 first, then went to 2020. I was like, this guy's a little tight. This guy's transitions aren't good. I mean, it just I don't see like how this guy was an All-American because again, I think that he was playing out of position, so to speak. He was doing things that aren't necessarily the best parts of his game. And I also think he was trying too hard, which meant the technique got away. When I watched the 2020 version of him, I was like, this is a different kid. He was efficient with his technique. He was clean. He was smooth. Like you said, he was instinctive. And I think that's the part that I like. Cam is explosive. That's the difference. And so I hope that we're sitting here at the end of the season and we're having a conversation about who's better. I hope it's a conversation at that point in time.
If it is, we're in a good situation. Notre Dame is in a very good situation if that is a legitimate conversation because we're talking about. I mean, again, Brandon Joseph is a preseason All-American. People have high expectations for him, right?
Right.
And I feel like that's going to overlook the best parts of Cam Hart a little bit. Not many people are talking about Cam Hart, even though I can vouch for this that the NFL likes Cam Hart, and I know we watched the film and we're like at times Cam Hart was a dynamic football player last year. But putting it together fully this year is the big step. Because I think, again, I have more of an understanding of what I expect from a Brandon Joseph than I do from a Cam Hart. Cam Hart, I think, is going to be a good football player, but I think he has so much more upside, man. Like, I think his ceiling is truly the roof. And I truly believe that with a Cam Hart. If you told me this time, and I know there's a difference between the best college football players and an NFL draft prospect, but this time, April, if you told me that Cam Hart was one of the top 2 or 3 corners off the board in the NFL draft, I would not doubt it because he has that type of upside, in my opinion. So I'm looking forward to seeing just how good he can be this year.
Let's bring it together before we move on to our final one. The final key is in the big games. They both combinations we talked about have to be on their game. And people want to know, why do you think Notre Dame actually has a chance to beat Ohio State at Ohio State? It's like, if I'm doing a prediction today, would I predict Ohio State to win? No. I mean, Notre Dame to win? No, probably not. I got to dive into some more film and hear how things are going for both teams in the spring. Are there any injuries? That's why I haven't made a prediction yet. But when I look at the two units, Ryan, that we discussed, that you start saying, okay, like, look, they have a front four that has a chance to be really disruptive and a back end that has difference makers. If they play like that against Ohio State, they'll have a chance. Because remember, the last time Brandon Joseph was on a field against Ohio State, he was part of a defense that had a really good secondary. But they were not an elite front four. They were just really good try-hard guys. And Ohio State was able to eventually do enough to win, but they held them to 22 points. Yep. And a big part of that was because they did a pretty good job of limiting the big plays from Ohio State. And so Ohio State still got some yards in that game, but Ohio State couldn't necessarily, I think it was like 500 some yards, only got 22 points because they limited the long touchdowns, condensed the field, and then they were able to force a bunch of field goals. I think Ohio State had, 1 or 2 missed field goals in that game, if I remember correctly. I think they had at least 1 or 2. And then you had the Brandon Joseph interception in the end zone, and that's the big thing. And it was because that secondary was able to stop those plays. You
Right.
look at Notre Dame, and the difference is Notre Dame is way faster and way more dynamic in the front seven compared to that Northwestern secondary was really good.
For sure.
And you
Yep.
saw how good Brandon Joseph could be when he had a elite corner that he could trust. Didn't have that last year. He should have that this year. And so if the secondary can play somewhat to the level that Northwestern's did 2 years ago, which is certainly possible, in my opinion,
they're more talented than that
across the
Northwestern
board,
secondary.
yeah.
100%.
Because Northwestern was great because they had two great players, Brandon Joseph and Greg Newsome. Greg Newsome was what? A tall, long, instinctive corner that could run. Well, remind you of anyone, Ryan? And that then elevated the rest of the secondary, who was not filled with NFL players. And so, but the difference is the front's better. So if Notre Dame is going to have a chance against Ohio State, the back end and the front end have to both play great. That's going to be the key. And if they can get to that point against Ohio State, against Clemson, against USC, against Bama, against Georgia, that's how Notre Dame wins those games. That's how they keep the points down enough to let the offense go handle its business. So it can't just be the secondary plays great and the D-line doesn't get pressure, because eventually they're going to pick you apart. It can't be that the front four plays great and the secondary's blowing coverage assignments, missing tackles, doing those type of things. They have to both play well. But the thing that gives me confidence that Notre Dame should be in this game and have a chance to win is Notre Dame is not hoping to out-scheme Ohio State. They have dudes that can match up against their dudes.
100%.
That's the difference. Final piece of the puzzle, Ryan.
Yep.
When you look at this secondary, it's got the stars, right? Established star in Brandon Joseph, a guy that showed a lot of star potential last year in Cam Hart. Got to be more consistent. The front, established star in Isaiah Foskey, a guy that has flash stardom in Jason Adamuola. The second level of defense does not have either one of those, in my opinion. You're kind of banking your hopes on a guy emerging who's got like 20-something career tackles, right? And Marist Liufau. But the reality is he's got star talent. And we saw it in the spring. We saw it in very limited flashes in 2020. What was funny about his 2020 season is there were snaps, Ryan, where you and I would both watch it. Not we weren't doing it, but like you know the snaps I'm talking about. Where you're like, wow, he had no clue where he was going on that play. But man, he looked good doing it. You know what I mean? Like he just has an explosiveness, a range that you're just like, wow, he did the wrong thing there. He was supposed to run fit to B gap, and instead he ran out here. But boy, he looked explosive getting out there. And you just know the talent's there. You can just see it. It screams at you on film, like dynamic.
Yes.
Well, last year was supposed to be that year and he got hurt. Now it's his chance to shine. And Marist is that final piece of this puzzle in these big games because his ability is so unique. He is the perfect linebacker for the Ohio States, for the USCs, the North Carolinas, the Alabamas, these teams that want to throw the football, because he can cover in man because he's athletic. He's a really good zone defender when he's doing what he's supposed to do because he's super fast and he's long.
Flexible too.
Yes. And third is he can blitz. And it makes him the perfect will linebacker for those type of teams. But will he be that on Saturdays? Big unknown. And I know we talked about it in the breakouts, but if Marist can be that star, this defense becomes a whole lot better. And for two reasons. Number one is it's asking a lot to ask all five of those dudes to be stars against anyone.
Right.
It just doesn't happen. I mean, I could point to championship games where, the LSU, what was the receiver against LSU against Clemson didn't play well? There was one receiver for LSU that I thought really had a rough game in that title game. And I can't remember who it was, but it didn't matter because everybody else did. Right? Everybody else played well. Somebody's going to have a rough game. Yeah. But if the more of those guys you have, then if Jason Adamuola is having a rough game, you can use Marist as a weapon to run stunt to maybe get Jason going. If teams are doing a lot to take Isaiah out of the game pass rush wise, guess what? You say, fine, we'll bring Marist and he can get after. Because one of the intel things we had last summer was, dude, our most dynamic pass rusher in fall camp was not Isaiah Foskey. It was Marist, until he got hurt. So if he can be that player, then he's got a chance to be a really dynamic second-level guy, and it's that fifth potential star. And what that does is it widens your margin for error.
Sure.
And last year, if Isaiah or Kyle had an off game, it really hurt the defense.
Mm-hmm.
The more of these guys step up and play that way, the better chance you have to still be good, no matter if one of your guys is not necessarily having that game. And I think that's what makes Marist very important, on top of the fact that he can just provide another playmaker to the second level of defense.
Yeah, and I saw someone in the chat say something about like undermining JD Bertrand for having 100+ tackles, and someone said like Jack Kaiser's a really solid football player. I think that kind of exemplifies that, right? Like they're good football players. We're talking about guys that we think have difference-making potential, right? Like that's the difference here for Marist Liufau, is he is a unknown commodity. But I will say this, Brian, the game that got me pumped up about Marist Liufau, and we've talked about this several times, is the Alabama game. Like I talked about with Jason Adamuola, because yes, were there mistakes in that game from Marist? For sure. But the one thing that I came away from that football game was Marist was not out-athleted in that game. He was a good athlete as anybody on Alabama as far as in the front seven in that game. Like he could match the athleticism of a Najee Harris in that game. He could. So you're looking at that and you're like, if he has a increase in eye discipline and just reading his keys properly on top of the athleticism, the length and the flexibility and all that length that he has as a football player, then we're talking about a big time player, right? It's not about, we're not trying to find the good football players on the defense, because there's a lot of good football players on this defense. There's a lot of guys that we can name that we would say are good to very good football players outside of the players we're talking about today. But Marist Liufau is the type of player that like force fumble, scoop and score, pick six, right? Like that's the type of guy he has. Big sack play, incredible closing speed. The difference-making potential is why we included Marist Liufau into this. Now, 20-something career tackles, right? He's an unknown commodity. But for 2 straight springs now, we have continued to hear the same things. This guy could be the breakout star. It unfortunately got delayed a year with the injury last spring, but I have big expectations for Marist Liufau. And if he is what I think he is and what I believe you think he is, and I think a lot of people think he is, then you now have a difference maker on all 3 levels, which is why this is so important. You have a couple dudes in the secondary potentially. You got a couple dudes up front. Nobody on the second level of this defense is for sure a difference maker right now. If Marist can be that guy, then that just accentuates the strengths of a Jack Kaiser, a JD Bertrand, because then you could departmentalize and just ask them to do what you do best. Marist will be able to do so many different things well that you can do what you do, and you do it at a high level. And I think that's what's going to make this the best. Because I personally think if Marist Liufau is the best version of what we think he is, that allows the other linebackers around you to kind of departmentalize their skills. And that's the best part of it, in my opinion.
Ryan, for me, it's kind of like what kind of frustrates me sometimes is when you say something about one player and people read into that must mean you have a negative feeling about another player. Not everybody's a star. Not everybody's a dynamic difference maker. That's true for everyone, including Alabama. I like to kind of go back and point out the 2009 Alabama season. And they had stars on that defense. Rolando McClain was a star. Mark Barron was a star. Kareem Jackson was a star, in my opinion. I don't think, in my opinion, that Javier Arenas was a star. He's a good player. Marcel Darius was a star that year. A little blast in the pass. But you know what that defense also had? It had Eric Anders. It had Corey Reamer. It had Brandon Diedrich, Lorenzo Washington. Terrence Cody was a star on that team too.
Wasn't Sunseri a safety on that team too? He was a solid football player, man. He was a good football player.
Right. And like Diedrich, I think it was like a 7th round pick. I don't think Lorenzo Washington got drafted. Eric Anders didn't get drafted. He was a 2-star, by the way. Corey Reamers didn't get drafted. I think half the starting defense on that Alabama team didn't get drafted. But they were really good, solid football players that did their job. And then the stars played like stars. That's the key. So saying this doesn't mean we think Jack Kaiser sucks. We don't. We've literally talked and said the opposite in recent shows, right? Same thing with J.D. Bertrand. We've said we think J.D. Bertrand is one of the more sort of disrespected players because there's assumption that he can't play. But he's not a star. And that's okay. Not everybody is. But the point is, when you have guys like Marist or Jason or Isaiah or Cam or Brandon Joseph, and they play like stars, then it makes JD and Jack and Riley and Howard Cross and Clarence Lewis and Tariq Bracy and Houston Griffith and DJ Brown and Xavier Watts, Ramon Henderson, every other kid that we could go down the long list and name, it makes them better players. It helps their production improve, and it makes the defense as a whole improve. Everybody's got their different roles. And the key for the problem for Notre Dame in too many different years is, A, they didn't have the depth of those players. I think that's what made the 2018 starting lineup so good and front four so good, is because you had good football players across the board. I think this has a chance to be their deepest starting lineup, 1 to 11, 1 to 10. I still have question marks about the second corner, right? I mean, Clarence has got to go show that he can be what I think you and I deep down think he has a chance to be, which is a good, solid player that you should be able to do a better job of protecting with your scheme, okay? And putting him in position to let him play to his strengths, which, look, as great of a job as Marcus Freeman did last year, and I think part of it is because he didn't have any choice, they did not play Clarence Lewis to his strengths last year. They put him in situations where they weren't asking him to do the things he does best. That's just my opinion. Will Al Golden do that differently? I don't know. Because it wasn't necessarily because they didn't know. They had no choice in order to do the other things, because there were too many holes in last year's defense because of a whole lot of different factors. Mm-hmm. And so if those guys play like stars, then you don't need those guys to necessarily do the things that they were asked to do last year. That's the point. And they didn't have guys. So when things were not going well against Oklahoma State, you had Isaiah Foskey that did his best to kind of save the day, and we saw the strip sack, but there was nobody on the second level that could make the stop the bleeding. Mm-hmm. And JD had a chance, and he couldn't get it done. There was nobody on the third level, including Cam Hart, because they just avoided him. Yeah. Right? They could take him out of the game, and there's nobody else who could stop the bleeding. There will become times where you're gonna be able to avoid Notre Dame star players. But the more of these guys that step up, the harder that becomes.
100%.
That's the point.
Yeah.
And that's the key. And it puts those guys at a chance to be – the other guys a chance to be effective, because now Jack Kaiser can just go do his job. And that's all Jack's got to worry about, and that's going to make him better. It's going to put J.D. Bertrand in position to just do your job. Howard Cross, Jacob Lacey, just do your job. Riley Mills, just do your job. And then if they have the talent, then their games can take them to another level, but they don't have to be the guy. Hey, DJ Brown, man, just do your job. Houston, Ramon, do your job. And that's the key. But if you just have 11 guys who are just solid players doing their job, you're going to be a pretty good defense, except when you play the best teams.
That's fair.
Then you're going to get exposed. And that's going to be the key. And that's why the stars got to play like stars at the end of the day.
100%.
Right? So it's not 5 stars and 6 bums. That's not what we're saying. Right.
If you have players that are playing like stars to that number, then you're just eliminating options for an offense, right? And that is the biggest thing that you can do against some offensive coordinators like to have options, right? Like they like to have the quote unquote the playbook fully open, right? Like they want to be able to just kind of pick and say, like, that's going to work, this is going to work, this is going to work. If you now have players that are taking certain things out of your playbook entirely, then you're limiting an offense. And against teams like Ohio State, maybe USC, maybe Clemson, we'll see what happens. I don't know what to expect with them offensively, but the point of the matter is to play against the really good teams that have those types of offenses, eliminating possibilities for them is the biggest thing, and that's what this defense has the chance to do, in my opinion. I think that they have that type of upside. They have to do it, but the talent is there, is the point of this podcast.
That's going to do it for this portion of the podcast. We're going to have a mailbag next, so stay around. Don't go anywhere. We're going to go right to the mailbag. As soon as we remind you to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, and make sure that tonight, 6 p.m. Eastern time, the IB Nation Sports Talk Show will be back. They'll have more fall camp discussion. There was no practice availability today, so there will be no practice from today to discuss. But they will continue talking about things. It will be Sean and Vince again. Want to congratulate my guy Vince. He normally watches this show when he's not on. Vince was able to share some big personal news yesterday. He was named one of the dean of students at Penn High School, which is the preeminent public school in this area. It's a great school. It's the school district that his kids also go to. So super happy for Vince. And it's something he's wanted to be at Penn for a while. And it was hard for him to leave Riley, but super happy for him. And I know how excited he was. I know when he called me the day he got it. And I just couldn't be more happy for him. So I want to say congratulations to Vince. Congratulations to him and his family. And we're happy for him. It's going to change some things for our podcast this season. But it actually is going to end up fitting in really well. But Vince is still going to be a part of what we're doing. It's just going to be his deal is going to be more. He's not going to be on the afternoon shows anymore, which we've kind of already told you we were kind of going to go away from anyway. But Vince is not going anywhere. If that's what people ask us, does this mean Vince isn't going to be with Irish Breakdown? No, Vince has always been a teacher. That hasn't changed. He's just going to be teaching at a better school, in a better situation for his family. Because when he's driving to school, his kids are going to be going to the same school. So it's good for him. But Vince will still be on with us in the fall. Him and Sean are kind of talking about what they're going to be doing on their night shows. He'll still be a part of our Saturday. He's going to be doing the college game day on Saturdays from 10 to noon with Sean, which we'll be guest hosts on from time to time, have our little guest spots. He'll still be doing the post-game show. And, of course, he and I will still be doing the Sunday night upon further review. So you're definitely going to get a lot more variety this year on the show than you did last year. It's not just going to be me and Vince all the time. So we're going to definitely have a lot more variety, which I'm super excited about. So very happy for our guy, Vince.
Everybody right now go tweet at Vince and call him the dean. Say congrats to the dean. Everybody blow his mentions up right now, please.
Yeah, there you go. So that's going to do it for this portion of the show, everybody. Let's jump into the mailbag. Ryan, got a lot of good stuff here today. Really good questions. We're going to jump off with it. We're going to start it off with this one from Caleb Collins. Caleb asked, most overrated and underrated players coming into the season. And he said, no Notre Dame players because he already knows our opinion on them. How would you know our opinion on them? You act like we do a show every single day for the last 3 months of the summer. I don't know how you know all those things, but I appreciate that, Caleb. But underrated, overrated players coming into the season. Let's have some fun with this one, Ryan.
Sure. Yeah, I wrote down a few because we got this one early when we were starting the podcast here. So should I start with the underrated or overrated first, Brian?
Let's go positive first because I'm really sick and tired of people coming. Like every time I write an article with something positive, it's like there are Notre Dame fans out there on Twitter. I really hate Twitter. It's like they are rooting for things to go wrong just so they can be miserable.
Yes.
Drives me nuts. So I've got a new policy. When people come at me with that stuff, I'm just blocking them. I don't care. I'm so over it. So I blocked like 7 people today. This ain't anything negative to me. It's just I'm tired of negative people. But yes, I want to start with the positive. So let's go with the underrated players.
There was a comment that you liked on Twitter for me today, and I blocked that young man. So yes, that did happen as well.
Peace out.
Yes. Deuces. All right. A couple underrated players, in my opinion. Wanted to start with a guy that not underrated by me and Brian as much because we ranked him as our 3rd ranked quarterback in college football, but that's Hendon Hooker.
Yep.
I think
knew you were going to go there.
Extremely underrated because for the majority of his career at Virginia Tech, he was marred in inconsistency, offensive play calling, and honestly, the coaching staff just didn't trust Hendon Hooker enough, in my opinion. So Hendon Hooker's one that I wanted to pop out there. I had Clark Phillips from Utah, who I know we've talked about on this podcast a bunch. Everybody talks about Eli Ricks, Keely Ringo. I rarely hear Clark Phillips' name, and I think he is one of the outstanding cornerbacks in college football. You can also throw in Garrett Williams into that conversation from Syracuse. I think he's a tremendous cornerback that does not get talked about. A couple years ago, Brian, when they had like Andre Sisco and Trill Williams and all those dudes, Garrett Williams was the best player in that secondary that year. He was fantastic as a redshirt freshman and pretty good last year, although he was dealing with an injury. My last underrated football player is Will McDonald, the defensive end out of Iowa State. He had like 12 sacks last year, and no one talks about him, man. Right. He is a really, really impressive football player. Sort of similar to a Myjai Sanders, a little bit longer, but like they're the same style. They're kind of like long, sleek style rushers, but I really like Will McDonald. I hate how they use him at Iowa State, but he's a really good football player in my opinion. So those are 4 guys that I wanted to shout out as underrated players in college football. The overrated list. Brian, we've talked about this first player a bunch. He has been on multiple All-American lists, and that is Andrew Voorhees out of USC, the offensive guard.
And he's not a bad player.
No, he's a good, solid football player, but he is not an All-American offensive guard, in my opinion. He's just not. He's a good player, not a great player. So I like him. He's not to that level, in my opinion. Another overrated offensive guard, Emil Ekiyor out of Alabama. Another preseason All-American. He's not very good, man. I don't know what to tell you. Like, he's just not. I'll say this. Andrew Voorhees is a significantly better player than Emil Ekiyor, but Ekiyor plays for Alabama, so we know what that does for him, right? Mm-hmm. So that's another one. I know someone just said Spencer Rattler in the thing. I'm not going to throw shade on Spencer Rattler because I don't think anybody has him rated very high right now.
Well, Pro Football Focus has him as the number 3 returning quarterback in the country, man. Wasn't he ahead of C.J. Stroud? I believe so.
What was the thing that you started when you started citing Pro Football Focus earlier that you said you don't
garbage analysis?
100%. 100%.
Yes.
Last overrated football player, and this player is a good player. I just think he's a little bit too high for me, and that's Eli Ricks that transferred from LSU to Alabama. I think he's a good player.
He's an incredibly talented.
Yes.
I don't think he's a good football player because he's incredibly undisciplined and immature.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah, yes. But I agree.
I think he's in a similar mold to a Trevon Diggs. I don't think he's incredibly explosive as far as long speed, but I think he's long and I think he has good ball skills, but I think there's a lot of plays that he's going to give up, right? So he's not my preference at the cornerback position, but he is a good player. I'm not saying he's not a good player, but he's not this All-American great player that people act like him.
Right. And I love the Ohio State fan now agrees with my comment on Eli Ricks, but the Alabama fan, hold on a second. I'm just telling you, you're going to quickly find out. And you're going to quickly find out. He's going to look like Patrick Surtain on some snaps and other snaps. You're like, dude, what is he doing? It just very, very consistently an overrated player. I'm going to go a guy that I think is a good player, but I do think is overrated is Jordan Addison. I do. I think he's a good football player. I think his production was a combination of system and playing in a bad league against a soft schedule. I think Jordan Addison is a good football player. I do not think he's what they make him out to be completely honest with you.
He had like 11 drops last year too. Like he drops a lot.
Now the ball was thrown at him a lot. I mean, so those 11 drops are going to, be a little bit lower if you're talking about the number of targets that, that Notre Dame receivers have. But I was not a huge fan of him last year. And you look at some of the games, we played good teams. He was good against Clemson. He wasn't great. He was good. He was okay against Tennessee. He wasn't great. I'm not a huge Jordan Addison fan as a star. Now he's like in his feelings about, I was promised this for NIL and I didn't get it. It's like, well, maybe you shouldn't have sold your teammates out. Maybe you wouldn't be in this situation, but I think he's a guy there. I think there's a lot of underrated quarterbacks in the country this year. You and I were talking about that when we were going through like Anthony Richardson getting all his hype. That's an overrated guy. There's a lot of these quarterbacks. Will Levis, I think, is another overrated quarterback. There's a lot of underrated players, and I mean, you guys know who one of my feelings is, but I wouldn't call him overrated, underrated. I think Phil Dracovich's being overlooked because of the injury last year. I think, which is that happens, out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. But
that's another good one that just reminded me. Zay Flowers is a very underrated football player because he played with bad quarterback situation after Phil got hurt last year. And I mean, I could, if I could count how many times that he was so wide open deep and they just could not get the football to him last year. Zay Flowers is a dynamic football player.
Yes. Very underrated player. I mean, and you're right. There are times this year he's one of the 2 or 3 best corners in the ACC or receivers in the ACC, which is impressive because there's some really good receivers. There's a receiver from Wake Forest, and his name is escaping me, that I think is a really good player.
A.T. Perry.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
he's like 6'5", can jump out the gym.
Yes. There were some times last year where, to be honest with you, I felt they were in situations where Sam Hartman didn't exactly throw him a great ball, but he has such a great catch radius that he was just able to kind of still go make a play. And he's a really impressive kid. I think he's going to be one of the top guys this year, in my opinion.
He runs surprisingly good routes for a guy his size too, man.
Yeah.
Like he can sink in and out of breaks. I like AT a lot. You should go look at it, Brian. He's got an impressive basketball highlight from high school too. It's pretty.
Oh, really?
So,
oh yeah, I'll definitely go check that out.
Yeah.
I think quarterback. Devin Leary is another guy. I think is very underrated as a quarterback. We broke him down in our look at the top quarterbacks coming back this year. I think he is very underrated. But like we released our top 15 and we didn't have Will Levis or Anthony Richardson in there. And I just I don't see it. But I think a guy who does not get a lot of pub is one of the best backs in the country. And again, similar to Phil Jakovic because he got injured last year. Muhammad Ibrahim was putting in work against Ohio State last year before he got hurt. He's healthy. Now, again, offensive line, they lost 4 starters on the offensive line from last year, 3 or 4 starters. They did get Quinn Carroll in. They revamped their coaching staff, which I think was absolutely needed. But I'm telling you, that kid is going to be one of the best running backs in college football this year. He had 1,000 yards in 2020 in 7 games. That kid is a really good football player.
Can we talk about how quietly, because Minnesota hasn't had a ton of guys that have translated well to the NFL level, but they always seem to have a good running back, man. You remember the Lawrence Maroney days and Gary Russell and all those dudes, some good players, man.
Yeah.
Amir Penix, I think his name was the 1 year. They've always had a good running back, it seems.
Yep. And they certainly have one this year. So just for conversation, he had 30 carries for 163 yards and 2 touchdowns last year against Ohio State. Didn't he get hurt late third quarter?
Something like that.
I mean, it wasn't 2 minutes left to go in the game. It was the third quarter, I think, is when he got hurt. I'll have to go back and look at that. But he's a really good football player. And in 2020, as I said, he played 7 games. He ran for $140 and 2 touchdowns against Michigan. He ran for 207 yards and 4 touchdowns against Maryland. He ran for 224 yards and 4 touchdowns against Illinois. Ran for $144 against Iowa. Running for 144 yards against Iowa is really good.
Yeah.
And he ran for 102 against Purdue, 108 against Nebraska on only 20 carries, and then $151 at Wisconsin in the last game of the season. Again, he ran for 295 yards in 2 games against Iowa and Wisconsin, who are pretty good run defenses.
He had 100 yards every single game then?
Every single game. His lowest output was 102. Now, again, they only played 7 games, right? But they were all Big Ten games. It's not like he had 3 games against non-conference opponents. He ran for 1,076 yards and 15 touchdowns in 7 games that season. And here's the other thing. If you go back and look at Minnesota that year, he's all they had. I mean, you knew the ball was going to him. They so underutilized Rashad Bateman, and he only played he missed 2 games. Mike Sanford's offense was terrible. You knew what was coming. I mean, it was we're running right here. You guys all know it, and it didn't matter. Now, they had a really good offensive line, but that kid is a tough, instinctive runner with some good athleticism. I really like that kid. He's a good football player.
The rare 6th-year running back.
Yeah.
Pretty bizarre.
Well, and he wouldn't be if it wasn't, you know what I mean? If it wasn't,
been in the draft last year,
the injury really stunk. And I hope he's healthy, but he played for a couple years. He was a 1,000-yard runner in 2018 as well. And then he kind of split carries and was banged up in 2019. Rodney Smith had 1,000 yards, and then, of course, he breaks out. So, I mean, he's had 2,000-yard seasons already, would have easily surpassed 1,000 yards last year. And, of course, this year he's gonna be really good. So I really like him as a running back.
I forgot Rodney Smith. He was a good player quietly for Minnesota as well.
Another one of those running backs to back up your point. Just another one of those good running backs.
Always have one, man.
Yep. All right, here's another question from Benjamin McCarthy. Are there times that players show flashes in practice, but when it is Saturday, they play their best football? Yeah, it happens a lot.
All the time, I think we call that a gamer. Yeah,
right.
It happens.
Exactly. Yep. I mean, it can be tough for coaches to do. I've shared this. I've had a guy like that. I mean, Michael Warfield was usually my 3rd best receiver in practice when I was at Duquesne, and the reason why, he just couldn't get loose. He was a very tightly wound player, and I mean that literally. He just couldn't get loose. He was always having to have the trainer come over and stretch him out in practice. But on game day, the adrenaline, for whatever reason, would just loosen him up, and he was dynamic. But I knew, like, look, as long as he's mentally locked in, that's all I care about. Like, just as long as I know you're executing your assignments, I don't care if you catch a bunch of balls in practice because they're going to show up on Saturday. I think that was something that the opposite of that is true. I think there's guys that are great practice players that don't look as good on Saturdays. And I think Ian Book is the epitome of that in Notre Dame. If you would have I've had people say, well, if Ian Book was so bad, why didn't Notre Dame coaches start him? I said, go to a Notre Dame practice and you'll understand why they start him. Because Ian in practice will, there are times you'd see what I'm talking about, like a joke that Vince and I had when we were at Notre Dame practices. We called him Captain Checkdown. You know what I mean? Because he would just, even in team, like in 7-on-7 and 1-on-1s, he's throwing beautiful passes. Ryan, I'm talking just dimes. But then he'd get to team periods and he's just, throwing a million checkdowns. And, it was one of those things that just after a while, it's kind of like, man, you just get frustrated by it. But he would not make mistakes. He'd get the ball where it needed to go to and those type of things. And so you'd kind of see that kind of stuff. So I think that's the opposite of that. You don't necessarily want that, but it's part of it too. And that's what makes deciding who to play sometimes challenging. How do you know a guy is a gamer if you don't give him a chance to play on Saturdays? And how do you give a guy a chance to play on Saturdays if he's not doing what he needs to do on Monday to Thursday? I think it makes it a very, very interesting aspect of being a college football coach. There's no doubt about it. Next question from Benjamin Karch. He says, last week you talked about Coach Freeman being the bridge between the offense and the defense. Do you think that will play a big role in the Notre Dame offense being more efficient this season? That's not necessarily what we were referring to. I think that where he could help the offense be more efficient is just establishing an overall philosophy of we're going to be a team of execution. And then you hold your coaches accountable to making sure that their units are that way. I mean, Sean Stiers wrote an article today on the front page of Irish Breakdown. And the article, it literally starts off with that. I mean, it's an article about Al Golden. And the article that Sean starts, this is how Sean's article starts, Ryan. Execution, execution, execution. I mean, that's what he said, because that's kind of what Al Golden was talking about. It's like, look, we got to execute. And I liked that Coach Golden, if you listen to the interview, Coach Golden had a lot of some interesting kind of comments that I thought was really, you watched him talk and he's like, we got a lot of speed. You know what I mean? And like, this is a guy that came from the NFL. You wonder if he's going to be a guy that's like, we run okay. We got to get faster, or, hey, we got to really make sure we're in position because we're not he was like, we got a lot of speed. It's like, this comment was kind of like, we kind of got to harness it, and that's going to be a key. But I think that's a command that comes from on high. Hey, we got to make sure we're a disciplined football team. I don't think he's going to have a say-so on efficiency from a dictating game plans to Coach Reese or dictating play calls or situational things. It's more of when we refer to the bridge, is to make sure that our offense and our defense are working together. So when our offense needs something from the defense, hey man, we need this. You can build your series, your next series around that. If this is head coach, you don't need to wait till the ball gets punched in the end zone. They're on play 7 and they're at the 42-yard line. And you say to Coach Reese, like, hey, if this keeps going, like, we're going to need to, these guys are gassed. We're going to need to, or if it's like been 3 or 4 series in a row and your guys are gassed, you say, hey, listen, Tommy, we need to go to our 4-minute offense here. Look, get a score. And if you see a chance, go for it. Right. But if we can, let's try to kind of maybe go a little slower this year, because we got to let our guys catch their breath. Or they just threw something at us. We need this. There's all types of different things that he can do, in my opinion, to combined with, calling timeouts and finding different ways to manage the clock. Those are the things that Coach Freeman will have to grow into. Hey, let's call a timeout here. And you kind of know that there's a TV timeout also coming up here pretty soon, in between the score, change of possession. Let's try to take advantage of that now. Those type of things are things that you can help. It's a little harder in football than it is in basketball. But if you have people around you that know that stuff, that can kind of help you manage your team during the game. Hey, let's call a timeout here because we want to give our guys a chance to catch their breath, or we got to make an adjustment, or whatever the case may be. So, Ryan, I think that's what we were referring to when we talked about the bridge.
That's like the situational side of football you don't really talk about too much, right? It's like you always think of like down and distance and what is the score at this point in the game and what's the time on the clock, all that type of stuff. But it's also dependent upon just the flow of the game, right? And I think that's your biggest thing, Brian, is like if the offense is running this way or the defense is staying on the field too long, or this outcome is this. It's being able to foresee the next step, and because at the end of the day, football is a chess match when you're a coach, right? Like it's about seeing the next step forward. So I think that's the biggest point, is that you want to have, obviously you have input to both sides. You're a head coach, but you also just want to be entrenched in both, that you understand like what are the needs of the offense right now for me, right? Like what are the defense's needs? What do those players need from me that is best going to make them the best versions of themselves? And I think that's the biggest thing, is it's just kind of understanding those situations based on being in it with them, being inside the huddles and being inside the frustrations and the positives that are going on in a football game. That's the biggest thing for me, to your points.
Every time Ian Book's name is mentioned in any kind of other than he's the greatest guy to ever put on a golden helmet, we get this comment.
Leading.
Didn't Ian Book win more games than any other Notre Dame quarterback? Just saying. You know what his record was against ranked teams? 5-5. Stop with the winning quarter. First of all, he shouldn't have been the starting quarterback, number one. Okay, he should have lost his job in the middle of 2019, number one. Number two, who'd he beat? Clemson without Trevor and their three best defensive players? My man, this is Notre Dame. Tony Rice beat more ranked teams in 1989 alone. 7. Tony Rice had more wins over top 10 teams than Ian Book had over top 25 teams in his career. He did that in 1 year. So with all due respect, Robert, I love you, and I love that you're going to bat for Ian, but just stop. It is what it is. It's not an insult. It's just the truth. The truth is not meant to be degrading. It's just the truth. There's a reason he didn't play well in big games. There's a reason that people think he doesn't have a good arm. It's because of how he played.
Yeah.
I mean, look, name me the big game Ian Book played great in, or, gave them the best shot to win, like Kyler Murray did against against Alabama in 2018. Where the only reason they lost by 11 is because Kyler Murray was just out there balling, right? I mean, there aren't those games for him. His moments are like, oh, he had a great comeback against a 7-7 Pitt team or a 7-5 Virginia Tech team in the fourth quarter of a game where it was only close because you had multiple turnovers in the red zone of each game, right? I mean, right, I'm sorry, I'm not giving you credit for bailing yourself out of a situation you put yourself in, and then you go shush the crowd when they're booing you because you're playing like crap the week after you went 8 of 24 to blow out loss to Michigan, right? I'm sorry. Yeah, nice kid and all that kind of stuff, but the Notre Dame quarterback is supposed to not just win games. That's a longevity award, right? That's like saying Pete Rose is a better hitter than Ted Williams because he has more hits, right? It's just to me, I can't go there. I'm sorry. I just can't go there. We had a super chat from Randy Hernandez. Here to stay. Keep up the good work, guys. Randy, I appreciate that, buddy. Very, 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 very much. Got some more questions here, Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Halloran. Jim says, Jordan Botello always seems to get pressure when he rushes the quarterback. Like to see more of that. What say you, Brian and Ryan? I know exactly what Ryan is going to say. Go.
I love Jordan Botello, man. I do. I think that he has incredible upside, Jim. So I'm with you, man. I think for me, Botello is one of those secret weapons on a defense, right? Because I think that you can play him at Rover sometimes. I think you can play him at Viper sometimes. I think you can take advantage of the athleticism he has. I mean, Jim, honestly, I think that there's some pass rush situations where I want Isaiah Foskey to be on one side and I want Jordan Botello to be on the other, because I think that he has tremendous ability as a pure outside speed rusher. I do. And I think that you could also take advantage of that playing in the Rover position, blitzing out from the slot. Like there's a lot of ways that I think the staff can use Jordan Botello, but the key is that you have to trust that he can bring that to you on a day-to-day basis. If he can, he's a secret weapon, in my opinion, this year.
It's never been about the talent with him. It's about what you just said. Can he show up every day? And so far, spring, summer, I haven't heard anything about negative. Well, since the spring, I haven't heard anything negative. There's some stuff I heard in the winter, but summer, I've heard good things. Most of the spring, I heard good things. Fall camp, I've heard good things. So Jordan Botello steps up to the plate every day, you've got a weapon. And you look at him, Justin Adamuola, and Isaiah Foskey, and Riley Mills as sort of your two deep at guys you could be throwing in on the defensive line as pass rushers. I mean, that's some really dynamic stuff there as edge guys. And I think there's going to be times, I hope there's times that we see Jordan, Justin, and Isaiah on the field together. And the reason I say that is because if you're seeing him in those scenarios, it means he has earned their trust. And it's never been a question of his talent, ever been a question of his talent. And if that talent starts being the storyline with Jordan Botello, he's a weapon. He's 250 pounds playing rover. I mean, does that say everything you need to know about his athleticism? You know what I mean?
Yep.
And he was an off-ball linebacker in high school.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, he played a lot of that. So I've always said I'd love to see him get a shot at Mike. And if they didn't sign Junior Tuihalamaka, I'd be pounding the table to say give this guy a shot at Mike. You know, if he's earned your trust, then give him a shot to play there, because he can move for his size. You don't need him to do that now because of you've moved JD to Mike and you've got Junior. You don't need to do that now, but he's a guy that if he can put it all together and get it up here, you know, that concentration, that focus, do the right things, he's going to make some plays this year. There's no doubt.
He's one of those, like, he's not the first guy off the buses in comparison to like an Isaiah Foskey, but like I remember watching him in a game last year. Was it the Navy game? I can't remember. Like I just saw number 12 and I'm like, oh, he looks like a dude, man. Like he just looks like that guy, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm excited. If Jordan Botello has his head on straight and you're not, he's the type of player where like I don't even need to hear good things about him. I need to just not hear anything
exactly.
about him. I don't need to hear a word about him.
Exactly.
If you don't hear any negative or anything about Jordan Botello, then it's like, okay, I have talent to play.
I will never ask a source, hey, how's Jordan looking in practice? I'll just ask, was he at practice? Was he on time? Yes? Cool. All right. That's all that matters. And, you know, that's a part of this conversation during the main part of the show that we didn't get into. We're talking about like the stars. But the reason we think Notre Dame has a chance to be so good this year, if those stars play like stars, is because we know what J.D. Bertrand can do as a good player in his role, and Jack Kaiser and Jordan Botello potentially, Howard Cross, Jacob Lacey, Riley Mills. We didn't even talk about Justin Adamuola that much today.
I know.
And he was second on the team in sacks last year.
Good player, man.
You know, I mean, he had twice as many sacks, I believe, right? Didn't he have 6 sacks last year? So, I mean, he doubled up Zach Harrison. He doubled up Zach Harrison last year. You know, the edge rusher that some NFL draft analysts and Pro Football Focus thinks is a better player than Isaiah Foskey. You know, he had 5. So just about doubled him up. So there's just a lot of weapons for this team. But the dudes need to play like dudes at the end of the day. But yes, great question, Jim, on Jordan Botello. Daniel Zolaki, my biggest concern is the size up front. Do you think Notre Dame will be vulnerable to the run against good teams?
We talked about this a little bit yesterday. I mean, there's going to be certain situations where size is going to be a negative, Daniel. It absolutely is. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you, but I think that Notre Dame runs their scheme as much up front from a one-gapping style that I don't think it's going to be a hindrance to you. But there are going to be certain situations where you're going to be like, man, I wish I just had one more guy that was the 6'4 plus 310 pounder. Like, I wish I had that guy. But I think that also can be eliminated because we haven't talked about them as much recently, but Gabriel Rubio, Jason Onye are working, right? So, like, if they can take a step up and give you some reps, then that's not as big of a concern, in my opinion. But, I mean, for sure, there's going to be certain situations where having a 265, 270-pound Howard Cross is going to hurt you at times. But then there's going to be a lot of times where it's a big help because he's going to be able to get instant penetration and make plays in the backfield, which is how this defense is predicated on having their success.
3rd and 1, goal line, you know, inside the 10. I think those are scenarios where you're like, okay, you're in tighter quarters. They're going to put their beefy personnel in there. They're going to run at you. You could maybe get overwhelmed there. And I think there's certain things you can't do defensively that can hurt you. So the only way it really makes you vulnerable against the good teams, in my view, is if you are in a scenario where you are trying to ask your nose tackle, who's 265 pounds, to 2-gap or eat up blocks. Just not what you don't want to be asking Howard Cross to play like you used Kurt Hinish, for example, because they'd ask Kurt Hinish at times to do that. And that wasn't his game either.
Sure.
But we saw, especially 2 years ago, and at times last year, because Kurt wasn't the same guy last year. He was banged up, kind of got banged up in the middle of the year, and great try hard, but he just didn't have quite the burst that we saw in the previous year because of the injuries. But you want to allow those guys to shoot gaps and penetrate. But then if you're going to do that, you got to use your linebackers to protect the other gaps a little bit. And the reason you do a two gap is because it allows your linebackers to kind of flow the ball, and they have different responsibilities because your nose tackle's eating up both A gaps. And I think those are sort of the things that you look at in those kind of, to me, those kind of scenarios. So I think there's an opportunity for this defense to use their size to an advantage, but it's impossible to completely avoid scenarios where it doesn't become a problem. It's just, if you're doing it right, Ryan, it's a very limited number of scenarios. And it's not like a matchup like, oh, you're going to have trouble against Georgia. Notre Dame's played Georgia in 2019 with an undersized defensive line and dominated Georgia up front. I mean, they really did a good job of shutting that Georgia run game down. They had like 2 nice runs, but they really did a good job of shutting it down. And a lot of it. And like, I've had somebody brought up Chris Smith, Irish Chi-Town loves asking you questions. So I'll let you ask this one. He says, how good is Chris Smith, the transfer from Harvard? Because on paper, he is that 310-pound guy.
Yeah. He actually checked in a lot bigger than I thought he was going to be, to be honest. I mean, because Brian, what was he listed at? Like 293 or 293. Something like that? Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So, I mean, I was expecting a also slightly undersized, but more size than you have currently. I mean, from what I saw with his career in the Ivy League, I think he's a good football player. He controls gaps well. I don't think he's an explosive player by any means, but like, I think it's solid. I would expect him to give you 10 to 15 snaps a game. Is that fair? Like, I think that he has potential to be a guy that can give you some snaps, but I wouldn't expect him to have this huge impact. It's just more about like being solid enough to give you something as a rotational player.
Got it. Let's go to the next question here. We Are Not Marshall asks, Brian and Ryan, do you see the linebacking core having a different starting lineup week over week as the skill set for each checks a different box for each opponent?
It's an interesting question. Yeah. I mean, I think more than anything for me, it's that Notre Dame is going to have certain packages against different styles of offenses, right? At times. So like, I think of how they've traditionally kind of prepared against Navy, right? It's like, Joe Schmidt's the weapon, and then Jack Kaiser's the weapon. And like, some of those personnel sets, I think, are going to be, I mean, like there's going to be times against USC, for instance, where like you're only keeping 1 to 2 linebackers on the field in general, even counting the rover. So I think it's just more mix and matching your personnel versus what the offensive system is, as much as like rotating completely. I think most weeks you're going to see JD Bertrand and Mike, Marist Liufau at will, and Jack Kaiser at rover. Like, that's going to be your base. But I think that there are going to be certain personnel matchups that you're going against offensively that if a team starts out in empty, for instance, or 4 wide a ton, maybe you switch up your personnel and you have a different type of look. But I think for the most part, it's going to be intact. It's just about what is the offense trying to accomplish.
Right. I don't think we'll see, kind of agree with you, Ryan. I don't think we're going to see changes in starting lineups, with the exception if they go to a 1 week they're in 4 down, the next week they want to be more 3 down because they're playing a pass happy team. I think what would be, since they're going to be such a rotation oriented group anyway, we may see guys at different spots, but it may just be more they adjust who gets more. Like, there may be some weeks where Junior Tuihalamaka plays 15 snaps because they're playing a team that's just throwing the ball the perimeter whole game. And that's not necessarily the game for him. And there may be other games where he's going to play 40 snaps because they're playing a team that's running the football. But I don't think it necessarily changes the starting lineup. I think it just changes the volume that maybe some guys might get in certain games. I think is where it would have an even bigger impact. Kevin Carter with the Super Chat. Kevin says, sorry to bring this up during the defense portion, but I missed the live show yesterday. It's all good, Kevin. That's why we have the mailbags, buddy. You are all good. So you just answer this in the mailbag portion of the show. He says, sincere question. Just curious if Rocco is still having issues with his footwork. Could ballet actually help him? Often used for big men, including Shaq, to help become more graceful on their footing. That's an interesting scenario. I mean, look, to me, all things are on the table if a kid needs to improve his agility. Mm-hmm. I think the thing that I would say is the type of training that Notre Dame does has a lot geared towards it to create some foot quickness. I actually think Rocco's issue in the spring was he just had some bad weight on him. And I think when, like, I don't know how to explain it. I really don't. I don't know how to explain this, what I want to say, Ryan, but
Mm-hmm.
I have seen guys weigh 310 with bad weight and they get heavy footed. And all they do is lose, in an offseason, they'll lose 5 pounds, be 305 to 307, and be way quicker. I don't get it. And sometimes the same weight and be quicker. I don't get it. I don't understand how that works. But bad weight can really wear you down. And I think Rocco, as a young kid, had some bad weight on him in the spring. He's bigger now than he was in the spring, but when you see pictures of him, it's better weight.
Yeah.
I don't know if he's in position where he's going to challenge this early, but I'm not. He's a redshirt freshman, and he was a borderline top 100 player. He wasn't Blake Fisher, number 24 player in the country kind of kid. He's going to need some time, and I'm not ready to write him off yet. What I have heard about Rocco this offseason is he's working hard, and that's the key. He's got to stay positive, keep working hard, learn from the veterans in front of you. And then, you still have 3 years to potentially go out there and win a starting job and play for 3 years. And if you have 3 years of starting experience under your belt for Harry Heastan and your goal is the NFL, you're going to have that opportunity because somebody's going to give you a look. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Irish Chi-Town, I'm going to assume the question is for you, Ryan. Do you expect the Adamuolas to both start this year?
In certain games, I think that it's possible. Like if you're playing a spread team, for instance, right? Maybe you might start Justin Adamuola as your Viper and move Isaiah to strong side defensive end, or you do vice versa just to kind of counteract the speed. So I think it's possible. I think more than anything, though, regardless if Justin Adamuola is starting or not, he's going to play a lot of football, right? Like he's going to be heavy in the rotation. I think at both weak side or both at Viper and strong side defensive end, there's going to be a lot of instances where you're going to try to get him on the football field as often as you can. So it may happen at times, Irish Chi-Town, but I wouldn't say that it is like, I don't think he's going to start most football games or anything, but I think there is an occasional game where you're going to look at him and say, against a pass happy USC team, this is one that just keeps popping to mind, maybe even Ohio State. Like we'll see what happens in that situation. Maybe you start him, especially if their philosophy is like, hey, we're going to come out and throw early. Justin is going to be even more important early on in those types of games.
I'm going to continue to pound this one on y'all and really hammer this into your heads. And I mean that I don't mean this disrespectfully at all. Because for most of our lives, Ryan, it's like you're too young maybe to remember this. Maybe you watch it because you played football. My generation, we grew up when we were young. The program came out.
Oh, that's my favorite football movie of all time.
And when Latimer sees these first on the depth chart, and but starting meant something big back then. There's still some positions where that matters. I mean, if you're number 2 quarterback, you're not going to probably play a whole lot, right? But for most positions, especially on defense, receiver, running back, it doesn't really matter who starts because for most of the game, you're not going to be playing with the starters anyway. There's going to be some sort of mix and match, especially up front in the defensive line. It's about your reps and are you in the game in the big moments? And I'm going to tell you right now, in the big moments this year, we're going to see a lot of Justin Adamuola. I don't care if he starts. I don't care if he plays 30 snaps a game, 40 snaps a game, 20 snaps a game. When it's a big series, you're probably going to see Justin Adamuola on the field. And I think that matters a whole lot more to me than is he starting. And I think that should matter a whole lot more to Jason or Justin than is he starting. And I think that's going to be a big part. And I think it does, which is why he's, continuing to put in the work.
I love that you just mentioned the program. If Notre Dame beats Ohio State, I will reenact that Latimer scene. Not with a real windshield. Not with a real windshield.
Okay, thank you.
I will reenact that scene. I will do that.
Thank you. You scared me for a second there. Yes.
Starting defense.
Yeah.
At the table.
No. Can you do a paper plate or something like that? So I don't have to
it's going to be a paper plate or something.
But
really either way.
I don't want to pay for your medical bills. This isn't TV. That's going to leave a mark. All right. That movie was a trip. Riza, it didn't give us our full names. It's BR. I love it. Simplicity. We know what you mean. If the secondary gets torched by Ohio State, do you worry their confidence will take a major hit and be a big issue going forward? Is simply not having a bad game enough to build confidence? I hope not.
It's a loaded question. I mean, I would like to say that one game doesn't define everyone and some people will be able to just kind of wipe it off, right? But some players are different. Like some players, a game can stick with you. Like it can. But I would say this. I think there's context to this, Reza. I think Notre Dame understands that like they're playing against some really good wide receivers and a really good quarterback, right? Like they're going to give up some plays. Like there's no doubt about it. But I don't think it's one way or the other. Like I don't think that you can completely kill confidence, but not every player is the same either. So like it's a loaded question, honestly, for me, because I know that bad performances do stick with players differently.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a fact. And that's a big determiner of being a really good player versus being a great player. Because usually great players kind of like brush the bad plays off. You know what I mean? So it is a tough question, but it's a reasonable question. I get where it's coming from.
I hope that it doesn't shake their confidence moving forward, and I hope that one not sucking against Ohio State isn't a confidence builder for them. They should be beyond that, and they should definitely be on that reason. I understand where the question's coming from completely, but I just feel this unit's better than this, and I feel the confidence of this team is beyond that to where I just don't want to be in a situation where we're kind of okay with them just not getting killed. You know, where you hear the players, well, we held them to their one of only sub 400 performances of the year passing. You know,
Yeah.
the whole, oh, well, we didn't lose to them by as many as the team in the championship game lost to them. You know, Bama lost by 28, you lost by 27. Guess what? You both got your freaking butts kicked. You know what I mean? Well, we didn't lose to Alabama by as much as Ohio State did. Okay, garbage touchdown late. Nobody freaking cares. And you didn't suck as bad as they sucked against Alabama is not like a claim to fame. I hope that this team is pissed off if they don't dominate Ohio State. That's the mentality that you have to have. Just like if Ohio State beats Notre Dame but doesn't dominate, if they're going to be a championship caliber team, they need to be pissed off that they didn't dominate. Notre Dame needs to be the same way. Hey, we held our own and we got the W, but you know what? We should play better than that. And I just don't think not sucking should be a standard of something that gives you confidence. I think the bar is going to be set higher than that reason. And I understand where the question's coming from, because this is one of those kind of BK PTSD things, because we've been kind of conditioned to say, hey, just hold your own in this game. I don't think that's the mentality of this football team. I really don't. I don't think that's the standard that Marcus Freeman and Al Golden and Mike Mickens and Chris O'Leary and Al Washington are going to accept for this football team. I really don't. I think the expectation is, no, we're going there to win. That's why we're going to Columbus. We're going there to win, not to – not get beat by a whole lot. I really hope that it's not that. That was fine in 2017, because you know what? They were building something then. They were when they lost to Georgia and they battled, that was a confidence builder, because that was a team coming off of a 4-8 year. I get why that moment was big for them. But now it should be about your confidence being built because you went and beat those teams, not because you didn't get killed by them. And that's not what he's saying. I'm projecting onto the team the question that he's referring to specifically of just the secondary.
100%.
Bam 88. Do you think Freeman will be more involved with the D, or since Golden has a lot more experience than Reese, he'll spend more with offense, or maybe just 50-50? I don't think it's going to be any of those things. I think it's going to be where his needs are in that particular day, or where his needs are in that particular week. I think that's going to be the key. Yeah. I think it's going to be like, hey, look, in this particular matchup, and I think part of it, hopefully, is my hope is that both coordinators, for this really to work, both coordinators need to look at Marcus Freeman as an asset. That's really got to be the key. Is Al Golden's got to say, hey, coach, we're breaking down some film. What are your thoughts on this thing here? And I'm not talking about going to him just to kind of throw him a bone to make him think you care about his opinion. But you're looking at like, I just don't feel really good about this third down plan we're coming up with. Hey, coach, here's what we're thinking. Here's why we don't feel good. And then what he can do is he can give you confidence. Hey, I actually like your plan. Here's why, and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, okay, I see it now. I feel good about it. Because Ryan, I'm sure even at the high school level, at my level, and all the way up to the NFL, there's times you put in a plan, you're just like, I've convinced myself it's not going to work. You don't always just convince yourself something's going to work. Actually, sometimes you want to pick it apart even more, because then you've thought through the possible scenarios where this could go wrong. And then you have someone come in that's got a different. So I said, hey, look, no, I like, or he can say, hey, look, I understand you're coming from here, but how about we bring this guy through the B gap instead and slant this guy across? And, because of the way they're, oh, yeah, it's a really good idea, and same thing with Ty Marist. Hey, coach, why are they doing this? You know what I mean? Like, they're doing this thing. If you were a defense and we did this, how would you react to it? How would you respond to it? What would give you a problem? In our 12 personnel, what are the things that gave you the biggest headaches as a defensive coordinator? That's where I want to see. And I want them to be the ones going to him, because that's the only way it's going to be absorbed in that instance. So I'm hoping it's wherever the needs are at that time, Bam. And this is a very good question. I just don't think it's necessarily either of those. And it'll change from week to week, in my opinion. I really do. I think part of it's going to be, what's the side of the ball he's most concerned about that week? What's the side of the ball that struggled the most last week? What's the side of the ball that's having the most discipline issues in practice? Hey, the offense is having a bunch of false starts. Okay, I'm going to go hang out and see if I can address why. You know, hey, secondary's been giving up a lot of big plays in practice the last couple of weeks. Or why? Okay, I'm going to be in the meetings this week a little bit. I want, not that he's taken over the meetings, but okay, is there something that's not being expressed clearly that the players aren't getting? Is there something? Right. Yeah. And I just think those things are going to change from week to week. I think there's one room he won't spend a lot of time in from a talking standpoint, and that's the offensive line room, because I think Harry's going to have the same policy. You can be in here, but, keep quiet, But, that's kind of how it was with Coach Eastham. But, I love the coach room the other day was like, man, I love hanging around those guys. I love being in that room. And you could just see the mentality he's trying to establish his team is, we're going to be physical. And he knows that that's and this is true for anybody. If you're going to be a physical football team, it has to start with your offensive line. Has to. And Al Golden mentioned that. Yeah, here's a quote from Al Golden that I loved that really got me excited. And this is from an article at irishbreakdown.com that Sean Stiers wrote today, which so far he's doing such a great job, Ryan, with his beat story so far. But there was a comment that Al Golden made about the Notre Dame offensive line. And it was this. He goes, it's a good group, and they make you bring your lunch pail every day. And they're really fun to go against. Harry's group, man, they are physical and really long. I mean, it's a long group. It's hard to get off their blocks. It's a challenge for us. That is such a 180, like in all caps, bold exclamation, whatever, 180 from last year when they were dominating the offensive line. Now, this doesn't mean that the defensive line has regressed. It means the offensive line has gotten a lot better. I mean, that was a storyline coming out of camp last year, Ryan, is the D-line this good, or is the offensive line that bad? I mean, it was every practice was the offensive line getting dominated by the defensive line.
The answer was yes.
Yes, exactly. But I'm hearing it from other sources too. Like, they love the D-line loves going against the offensive line this year. They hate it, which is why they love it, if that makes sense. And it's going to make both of them so much better. It really 100%. Is. But I 100%. Loved hearing that comment. But again, there's going to be weeks it's going to change. Back to the question. John A1, does Cam Hart have the potential to be what Patrick Surtain Jr. was for Alabama in 2022?
I mean, the impact, yes, I think so, John. I mean, it's tough to compare someone that has that much potential, but he's an unfinished product, to a player like Patrick Surtain, because honestly, I mean, Pat Surtain was such an advanced player when he got to Alabama. And that's why he came in as a freshman, was just kind of a guy, right? And so I hate making the comparison just because Pat was just so good from the jump with Alabama. But to your question, for a single season, yeah, it could be possible. I mean, Pat Surtain was just a guy that for Alabama his last year, you just didn't throw at, man. Like, now I'm good. Cam Hart was kind of that way somewhat last year, and I think that it could be that direction where you're just like, all right, I'm good. I don't need to throw at number 5. Like, I don't need to do it. So I think the impact could be the same. I just struggle with comparing a guy to a top 10 pick. Patrick Surtain Jr., for people that don't follow the NFL, last year as a rookie for Denver, he was good, man. He was really good. He's just a really good football player, Pat Surtain Jr., but I do think Cam Hart can have a similar impact, yes.
Hope so. 99 problems, but BK81. So great to hear right now. My fear is that you are only as strong as your weakest link, no matter how incredible Cam Hart and Brandon Joseph are. If the second cornerback, or safety is weak or suspect, you're limited to that. I understand the thought, but here's the thing. Here's where the comparison falls apart, and I understand the premise. But in football, it's not just you're holding a link with 11 chains on it, and if one is weak, it will break. There's no doubt. But in football, however, especially on defense, there are ways you can kind of manipulate the chain to where you can sort of support the weaker chain, the weaker link with stronger links. And then you make it stronger, right? Where they can take the pressure off the weaker link and then it doesn't break, right? And that's why we talk about what we're talking about right now is if the opposing quarterback never gets time to throw, guess what? He's not going to beat Cam Hart or Clarence Lewis or the second safety or whatever the case may be. If you can have a second corner who maybe isn't a great man-to-man cover guy, you can adjust your coverages to protect him better. That's the whole point of what we said about Clarence Lewis last year. A lot of the instances where Clarence got beat were not situations he should have been put in the first place because that's not playing to his strength. And it's the job of a coach to play to his player's strengths whenever possible. The problem was last year, in order to play to Clarence's strength, you had to not play to a lot of other guys' strengths. And that's what put Notre Dame in such a tough spot because you're not going to have Kyle Hamilton playing over top of the defense all day. You can do that more with Brandon Joseph than you could have with Kyle Hamilton because he's a different kind of player. You can do that with Ramon Henderson if he has some experience under his belt. So I understand what you're saying, 99, and you're accurate in what you're saying to a degree. But the more the other players step up and play like stars, the less pressure, less burden there is on a Clarence Lewis where he doesn't have to cover as long. You can do more things with your safety because you don't have to insert your safety into the box to protect against the run because your box six players are dominating the run. And that's what we talked about earlier. If Jason Adamuola and Isaiah Foskey and Riley Mills are just locking down the run game, you don't have to get your 8th and 9th guy inserted into the box, which allows you to play more cover 2 to a side or play more maybe cover 4 to a side where Clarence can play off the ball, which helps him to better protect the deep ball. There are different things you can do to protect him and then play to his strengths. And I think if Clarence makes the improvements we hear he's made, and you can then now adjust your scheme or where he's lined up to protect him and play to his strengths, then he will be better. Is he going to go out there and lock down Jackson Smith and Jigba for 60 minutes? No. So guess what? Don't put him in that situation, and you're going to be all right. And I think that's going to be the key. Is going to be that. So I understand the premise, but it just doesn't fit in football if you have other really good players. That's why it is important to focus on what we focused on today, which your stars got to play like stars because they can solve a lot of those problems or at least alleviate a lot of those burdens. Travis Connor says, I know we're talking defense, but if you had to place a bet on either Marist or Tyler Buchner breaking out, where would your money go?
Yes.
Yeah, why can't I have the option of both? I'm doubling down on it. No, if I had to go with either of the two, I would probably go with Tyler.
I would too. I mean, it's just, yeah. I mean, I would go with Tyler for one selfish reason, right? It's the fact of quarterback's more important than a linebacker. I mean, naturally, right? And then number two is I just think that the mental makeup that Tyler has is just something that I think is really going to do well with this transition. So it's a more important position, Travis. So if I had to bet, I would bet on Tyler Buchner because I just think the importance matters so much. But I personally think that both are going to have really good years. So we'll see, though.
Yep. I'm honored. Irish Chi-Town asked me a question. I appreciate you. I'm just giving you a hard time, by the way, on that. Said, Brian, which freshman on defense do you expect to make the biggest impact? I think it's going to be Jaden Mickey. I do, and I think Junior's going to play a lot. I do. Mm-hmm. I do think Junior's going to be he's going to make he's going to make an impact on this defense this year. I believe that. I just think Jaden Mickey by the end of the year is going to be playing a lot, and it's going to make an impact. I really do. I really do. Now, if we're talking about because you said defense, right? Now, if you're going to just say which defensive recruit, I think it expands a bit because I think guys like Nolan Ziegler and Jalen Snead are going to have a really big impact this year on special teams. They're defensive players. I think they're going to have an impact on special teams, but I think just on defense, I'd go with Jaden Mickey. Ryan, what do you think about that?
That's an interesting one. I really can't think of another one that I think is going to have a tremendous impact. So I'll say one of the corners, whether it's Jaden Mickey or if it's Benjamin Morrison. I'll say this too, Brian. We didn't talk about this. Jaden Mickey looked kind of smooth returning punts the other day on the video that you put out too, man. Yeah. So, I mean, I think having the spring under his belt's big time. And I think the biggest part about it for me, I mean, he's a talented player, obviously, but being being as competitive as he is, I think is a big upside to him playing this year because he's one of those kids that cornerbacks are very important, right? Because you're going to get beat at times. Jaden Mickey's the type of kid that is just not going to stop talking, even if he gets beat, like that is just going to roll off his shoulders. So I think Jaden Mickey's a good pick. I could see it being Benjamin Morrison. I think one of the cornerbacks is going to have a role, but I would say Mickey has he has kind of the inside track because of the spring, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to the next one. We have a super chat from Mark Stewart. Will Coach Freeman and Coach Golden be willing to play Mickey and other young corners in Columbus, or will they defer to the vets? And I thought it's a good time to follow up with this one. With that, I think it just depends on how practice camp goes.
Yeah.
The big thing, when I talk to different sources around the program, they'll praise like Ryan Barnes and Chance Tucker, but it's just about, can I trust him to go out there and do the job, play after play after play after play? And that was the question for them. I don't hear that same concern and question mark about Jaden Mickey. He's already established a level of trust with the staff that you don't see a lot from freshmen. I'll be so shocked if Jaden Mickey doesn't play against Ohio State on defense, not special teams, defense. Right. How much will it be? That's a good question, Mark, and I don't know the answer to that one. But I'll be surprised if he doesn't play. I could see scenarios where, and again, Ohio State this year is going to look a little different than last year. If Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave are coming back, I'd say I don't be shocked if their starting lineup is Jaden Mickey in the slot and Tariq Bracy outside, or vice versa, because you just want to get your speed on the field against Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave and Jackson Smith and Jigba. All of them are like sub 200 pounds. Jackson Smith and Jigba was the tallest guy, like 6'1", right? This year it's going to be different. Marvin Harrison's like 6'4". Emeka's 6'2". Julian Fleming's a big guy. Now Jackson Smith and Jigba is your small receiver. And so it's going to be a different group. And that's something too, what the offense at Ohio State looks like is going to look a little different this year than what it did last year. Because I think Ryan Day is a good coach that's going to build around the strength of his pass catchers. He's not going to ask Marvin Harrison to be Garrett Wilson. He's not going to ask Emeka to be Chris Olave. They're different players. And so I think that's why that's some of the uncertainty that I have. And I know we had the bowl game and all that, but that was just one game against a beat up team. They're going to do some different wrinkles. Now they have the whole offseason to play to it. So I think how Notre Dame counters that personnel-wise is going to be really interesting, to where I would have not played Clarence Lewis against Ohio State if Olave and Garrett Wilson come back. I literally would not have played him. And then when I did play him, he'd be in the slot with a safety over top on the whole game. Bad matchup for Clarence. Yeah. This matchup, however, with Marvin Harrison and Emeka is a different, better matchup for him, because it's more about size. Now, those guys can run, but it's more about size. You now kind of want Clarence's size out there, where it's not ideal to necessarily have Tariq and Jaden Mickey out to the field the whole time, because now you're throwing bigger bodies at them. So I think that's going to make this a little bit interesting. But I do know this. We will see Jaden Mickey, barring injury, in the opener at some point in some kind of role against Ohio State.
That's why I'm curious to see how the Ohio State offense functions a little bit. I know you said you imagine Jackson Smith and Jigba might play a little bit more outside. I'm a little more hesitant on that, just because I think that the other receivers around him are vertically oriented, where I think why would I move Jackson out of the slot? You know what I mean? I would just kind of let him feast inside and let Marvin Harrison with the 6'3" length that he has, and Emeka with the 6'2" explosive length that he has. I would let them play outside the numbers a little bit more than, playing than a Jackson Smith and Jigba. It's just my 2 cents to it, but we'll see.
The reason I say it is because I think when you have a guy who's your guy and you just line him up in one spot, it makes it harder to defend. It makes it easier to defend him. And as much as I like Marvin and Emeka and those guys, they're not Garrett Wilson. They're not Chris Olave in this matchup and early in the season. And so last year, you could just take the pressure off Jackson he was actually taking the pressure off them. So you didn't need to move him around, and now they're going to have to find a way to take the pressure off him. And are you going to ask those guys to just be stars? Like they just let Garrett go out, be Garrett, I think Ohio State that's where I'm coming from. And again, this is kind of also more of me and my coaching hat of, okay, let me make sure I'm prepared for that. Because what you can't do is practice where Jackson's going to be in the slot for 95% of the snaps, and then they're putting him at X the whole game. And you had this game plan built around taking their slot out of the game, and now he's not there anymore. And I think that's kind of thing you have to be prepared for, is what do we do if they move Jackson to X, certain amount of plays? What if they move him to boundary? What if they motion him a whole lot? What if Ohio State's thought is they're going to put Cam Hart on him, so we're going to move him the whole time or move him early to find out? I think those are things I'm looking forward to seeing. All right, we got some more here, Ryan. We did get a super chat that came up. I want to pull that up from Riza. Thank you very, very much, Riza. He said, OSU had mixed performances in big games last year. What did you see from Stroud in those games? He torched a lot of bad teams. Was he big time in big games? what gave him problems. Notre Dame set up well to replicate. It's a good, very, very good question, Ryan. You and I were just talking about this yesterday.
Reza, so he really improved tremendously down the stretch of the season. And I mean, people are going to talk about, obviously, the last game of the year against Utah. There's a little bit of an asterisk on that game just because, yes, he played a phenomenal game. He put up some crazy numbers, but Utah was beat up tremendously. But I will say the biggest differences I saw in CJ Stroud down the stretch comparative to early in the season was, one, I mean, he was just going through things. He was processing a lot quicker, right? Like he was getting off his first read a lot quicker, and he was getting to second and third read down the stretch of the season and doing it at a very crisp manner. And I think you saw the latter stage of the season better pocket manipulation. He's a kid that I don't think uses his athleticism enough all the time, but he does have pretty good pocket movements for the most part. The thing that I believe can get him off his game is he does not want to move off his spot. So if you get some interior pressure or just consistent pressure overall, I think you can speed up his process and his feet a little bit, and he can get stuck on his back foot, fade off a little bit. That can hurt his process a little bit, right? So I think that's the biggest thing is you need to pressure a guy like a CJ Stroud, but he certainly, by the end of the season, he was playing tremendous football. There's no doubt about that.
I think a lot of the stuff that you could point to last year that gave him problems is not stuff you can just assume is going to give him problems this year. I think some teams could kind of throw him off a little bit with some rolled coverages. The problem was none of them were good enough to call it off, to pull it off. And I think Michigan was. And it's not necessarily baiting them into interceptions as much as it's just baiting them into completions, getting them behind the sticks. And what Michigan was able to do, more than anyone, even more than Oregon, because I think against Oregon, part of the issue was his inexperience, missing some opportunities. I think he reacted to pressures that weren't necessarily there yet. Michigan straight up harassed him, and he didn't play well. Guess who else doesn't really handle getting pressured all the time? Every other quarterback in college football. So I think he did show some maturity, but I think it's a situation where I think he is going to improve, and a lot of that had to do with him being young. And I think this year you're going to have to literally hit him in order to kind of rattle him the same way. I think this year, though, pressure's only going to go so far. You're going to have to find ways to get him thinking, because teams weren't making him think late last year, Ryan. They were just trying to rely on pressure, which worked early in the season. They weren't doing things to kind of get him guessing. And I think Mike McDonald did a really nice job of making him not feel comfortable with where he was going to go with the football. I think that's a big thing too. The other part is you have to be willing to let him get his yards. That's going to be a part of it. It's like, if you can't get to him, you got to be okay letting him get his yards. And what I mean by that is I'm not playing a lot of cover one. Press, come up and play cover one, because if you do that and you don't have success, it's going to be a big play. Mm-hmm. And so to me, it's like, I'm going to be okay, letting him catch a slant and then we just hit him right away. There's going to be some of that. And so the goal is to hold him to 240 yards passing. If you do that, you kill Ohio State. You're going to, well, unless it's because they ran for 350, but if you're able to kind of be good against the run and then you don't hold him to 240 yards, you're going to dominate. The offense is going to get their yards. I mean, didn't he have he had like 440 something like that against Oregon?
Yeah, it was a crazy number like that.
So he's going to get his yards. It's just about, can you make him throw more to get those yards? That's key. 484 against Oregon. He threw 54 passes. Against Michigan, he threw for 394 yards.
He actually had a pretty good game against Michigan, though.
But he threw for 49 yards.
Yeah.
And he threw for 49 passes. Well, the 394 yards is good, but he had 8.0 yards per attempt. That's not a real great number. It's not a terrible number, but it's not a very good number. He was over 10 the rest of on average for the year. So it's those things, right? It's Michigan let him get some of those easier yards. But what they didn't let them do is hit the bombs over top or get those guys in space where there was no help. And I think, because why? Why could Michigan get away with that? Because their front four was able to put pressure on the quarterback.
I was going to say they harassed them all game.
With their front four, which then when they did bring pressure made it even more effective. And that was the key.
Honestly, they were eating with their front two, for being honest. It was just hit Hutchinson and Njabo all day, which was crazy. But
no doubt about it. Here we go. Jason Rose, Phil Dracovic is better than Ian Book. No argument there. But how do you guys feel that with Jurkovec? But do you guys feel that with Jurkovec, the outcomes versus Bama and Clemson would have been different?
I don't.
Yes, and yes, I do. I think the championship game in 2020 would have gone a lot different if Phil Jurkovec was your starting quarterback. It would have. Notre Dame completely outplayed Clemson for the first quarter and half of that game. They couldn't put the ball in the end zone. Should have been 17-0.
I hear that. I feel like it was more a coaching problem than a player problem. As much.
How so?
I don't know. I don't think that Notre Dame was confident.
I'm not arguing. I'm generally trying to get what you mean by that.
No, I think that Notre Dame's coaching was not. I don't want to say prepared. That's not the right word, but I don't think that they were confident enough in playing their game to hang with them. Like, I mean, I just felt like under Brian Kelly, there was just always a defeatist attitude with everything that you were going, right? It's just like, we're not going to be able to run the ball. We're going to try to keep this game close. Like, that's just, I think it's a mentality thing and that we know that leadership trickles down from the top down, right? So I just think that there was a defeatist attitude that was kind of running the program, if I'm being completely honest. I think that it would have been a closer game if Phil Jurkovec was there, but I don't think it would have dramatically altered.
We're talking 2020 ACC title game, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Just want to make sure on this, because somebody was bringing up the Claypool play. I want to make sure you and I are on the same page. Here's why I think you're wrong about the Clemson game. I agree with you 100% about Bama. Notre Dame went into that. I was at that game. They started that game off extremely confident because they had already beat Clemson. Right. And so there was a different mindset in that game. If you remember on offense, they came out first drive, went right down the field. And they had a third down play against Javon McKinley where we've seen Phil Jurkovec make that throw to Javon McKinley on the one-on-one corner route a bunch of times because he was one to make those plays. And I think they ended up I think they made a field goal on that drive. Clemson goes down. I'm actually going to pull this up because Clemson went down, and I think that was the following drive. Notre Dame might have picked Trevor off. I'm
Kyle
trying to
Hamilton, right?
It was a tip pass by Drew White, and then Kyle picked it off.
Yep.
And Notre Dame goes back down the field. Let me just pull up the play-by-play so I can have a refresher. They got yes, I was right. They went down and got an interception. Then Notre Dame went right back down the field, 7 plays, 56 yards. Ian was rolling, and they settled for another field goal attempt, and it was missed. So like it should be 10-0 right now. At worst, 10-0, maybe 14-0. And then Clemson goes down and scores. Notre Dame goes down and drives again on Clemson, and Ian had 2 big misses in the run game, and then they had the 4th down throw that went incomplete where Avery Davis was actually open and he missed him. And so that it's like, so it was those kind of things where the problem was the failure to execute. And there were several times early where Notre Dame had chances with a more gritty quarterback would have made those plays, Ryan. Now, what I'll say this, once Clemson jumped out, we saw the air in the balloon just crush. Because I mean, I'm sitting in that game and I'm up in the press box because I could still go to road games then, and I can still go to road games, and you're watching just the energy just sink out, and that's where the Brian Kelly impact had an effect. Because once things didn't go their way, it was like the air was let out of the balloon. But I'm telling you, the first couple drives of that game, Notre Dame was like, "We got you." And I just feel like with Phil Jurkovec, the quarterback, it's 14-0 before Clemson gets on the board. And then when that big pass play to Amari Rodgers happens, they're like, that's all good. We're going to go right back down and score on them. It was a different energy that game, but it wasn't because of Brian Kelly. It was because of they had already gone out and beat Clemson once, and I think there was a confidence there. And Tommy Reese's early game plan was really good. Clemson didn't have any answers for him early. It just Ian Book wouldn't throw the ball. Just wouldn't throw it. There was another play in that game where Avery beat them on the same route he beat them on in the game earlier in the year, and Ian wouldn't throw it. Because why? Because it was in a situation where he had no choice on that final drive but to throw that ball. He had to. Game's on the line, and so he was more willing to do it. And that's why Ian was always so good in those fourth quarter moments. That's the one thing Ian was really good in those fourth quarter moments. Why? He had no choice. You have to throw it.
He would let loose, yeah.
You have to throw it.
Yeah.
And then he was really good. That's why he sucked the whole game against Pitt in 2018, except in that last drive when they needed him to throw it because there was no, hey, dude, if you don't do it now, we're going to lose. And he was great. Same thing against Virginia Tech. He sucked for 3.5 quarters against Virginia Tech. But that last drive, you got no choice but to let her rip, buddy, and he looked great. I just wish we'd have seen that version of Ian for the first 3.5 quarters. That was my problem with him. But that game was the same way. So that's why I do disagree with you on that game. I think the only difference in the Alabama game is it would have been I think the margin would have been similar, but it would have both been higher points. Because Alabama wouldn't have took their foot off the gas because Notre Dame would have kept scoring. You know what I mean? So it would have been like, what was a 17-point margin, 31-14? It'd have been like 41-24, in my opinion. Is that fair?
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
The game would have been the same outcome, but it just would have been a little bit more entertaining, and you wouldn't have felt defeated.
It would have looked different, but it would have had a different perception if that was the case, though, if we're being honest. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing with those games is that Notre Dame offensively has just not been up to par, right? So, their perception would be a little different, even though you still have to win the big game. I think that the Notre Dame fans would have a little more confidence if that was the case right now.
Right. I agree. Okay. Let's go to some more. We have a couple more here as we wrap up here, Ryan. Irish Chi-Town says, Brian, do you expect Al Golden to use his Bengals playbook, or will there be a mix between his and Coach Freeman's plays? Neither. I mean, I get it. Look, it's going to be the same playbook that they've had. So basically, same calls. He's going to incorporate, I believe, his kind of calls into what Notre Dame is already doing. It's just going to be sort of his take on it. So I don't think he's going to be bringing in the Cincinnati playbook. I think it's things that he believes in, and then building them out from what is already established is what I think we're going to see. And I believe I've been told that they are going to try to keep the terminology and stuff the same. So then he just has to learn. It's the same call, but he's got to learn what they call it at Notre Dame, as opposed to one guy learning that, as opposed to everybody else having to learn what he calls it, is what I believe we'll see.
I almost made a Brian Van Gorder joke.
Oh, no, please don't.
I stopped.
Yeah. Thank you. Nick Papella joined late. Not sure if this was talked about or not, but the Big Ten's new TV partnership with NBC, good or bad for Notre Dame? Ryan, did you see that yesterday?
I saw someone post something about it, but I haven't read up on what the deal is or anything, so I don't have enough about it.
I don't know a ton about it yet, and I was planning on reading more about it and talking to some different people, and I think it was something we were maybe going to discuss this weekend on our on one of our shows over the next couple of days. But here's my early understanding of it. Okay, so again, bear with me if I have to change my mind, because we are in a situation where still gathering a lot of information. Basically, they're no longer going to have any Big Ten games on ESPN. They're all going to be aired on Fox, CBS, or NBC. Because the Big Ten has never had a deal with just one network. They had a deal with Fox and ESPN, much like the SEC had with CBS and ESPN. And so even when CBS had the SEC contract, it was for one game a week. Well, Fox really only carries like one Big Ten game a week. So what you're going to have now is you're going to have all the Big Ten games carried on Fox, CBS, or NBC. I don't think this puts Notre Dame in I think my gut reaction was, I feel as if this was the Big Ten sort of trying to take away all the possible options for Notre Dame to try to force Notre Dame into a conference. That's what I kind of was my read on it. But as a good friend of mine who's given me some really good intel on all this conference realignment stuff, he said, if anything, if that was their intention, and it may be, but if it was their intention, it would simply just force Notre Dame to say, hey, ESPN, you guys want to throw some money at us now, right? Now that you lost the Big Ten? Because now of the two future super conferences, ESPN just lost one of them. They lost any rights to one of them.
So that might open up opportunity. Gotcha.
Now, what you've really done is you've now made ESPN a competitor for Notre Dame where they wouldn't have been before. So that was a good answer by him. I don't know if that's what the Big Ten's trying to do, but part of me wonders, because why partner with all three that way? But I also don't think it necessarily shuts the door on Notre Dame at all. I think if anything, it's hey, now let's really crush the ESPN by getting Notre Dame to be with us. And I don't think it would require them to force Notre Dame out of a league, or into the league. I mean, out of independence and into a league. So I think it'll be interesting. What I ultimately, and I brought this up to some friends, and this is 100% my opinion. This is not something that I have any information on, or I've heard from a source or anything like that. So I want to make sure that I'm clear on this. Part of me wonders if Notre Dame honestly doesn't mind the ACC blowing up. Because what happens is if the ACC blows up, and let's say if any team leaves the ACC, it's going to make it very easy for Notre Dame to get out of their ACC contract. Mm-hmm. Because the contract, the league that we agree to be a part of does not exist anymore. Because what's happening is ESPN is trying to get some of the ACC teams to leave, come to the SEC, which would then allow ESPN to counter by negating their contract with the ACC that goes into the 2030s. Because I don't think deep down ESPN knows they can't afford to pay both leagues. I think that's an issue for them. And so they want to bring in the teams that they like that are from big markets or states that they don't have a presence in right now, like North Carolina, Virginia, states like that. Get Clemson and Florida State. They're the big names, maybe a Miami. And then the ACC's done. Part of me wonders if maybe deep down Jack Swarbrick's at the point where he's okay with that because it gets you out of there and then allows you to go sign a similar deal with the Big Ten, where you play 4 to 5 Big Ten teams a year. You're on the same network kind of with them. You get the 3:30 slot every week, except, you get to kind of pick 2 night games a year that you get to pick the games you want, just like they're doing now, but they're kind of part of a bigger package that also includes the Big Ten. And having that as a potential option, because clearly there's some level of a relationship with the Big Ten because the hockey team plays in the Big Ten. I don't think I wouldn't necessarily love that. I don't want any part of the Big Ten for football. It's just my opinion. I'm just trying to kind of be honest and objective about what may be an option for Notre Dame. Because I think, as I've said a million times, Notre Dame has no interest in going into a conference, none. But that doesn't mean there might not be some different partnerships with different conferences, if that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. So, but again, that's just a gut read. This happened yesterday. I haven't had a chance to talk to any sources about it. I just talked to a couple buddies who know some things and just kind of get their read on it. And I'm very curious how it's going to play out. Very curious how it's going to play out. Like, do they? I mean, are these networks going to stop at the Big Ten? We got the Big Ten, we're good. Or are they going to say, hey, look, we can really take it to ESPN now. If we can get Notre Dame now, if anything, it might ramp up their desire to go get Notre Dame. Because now they're going well, we know what ESPN is going to do. ESPN is going to throw the kitchen sink at Notre Dame now. Mm-hmm. Potential thoughts there, right? And so, hey, or even if it's, hey, ESPN goes to Notre Dame, hey, if you guys join the ACC, we'll tear up that contract and give a new one, and here's what it'll look like. Or if you guys just want to join as an independent, here's what we'll do. I think if anything, it could create a scenario like that where now Notre Dame becomes the big prize. Because now the Big Ten's got their deal. So now what's the one big prize still out there for TV networks looking to battle each other? It's Notre Dame. And now ESPN didn't need it before because they had the Big Ten and the SEC, and they didn't need Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Maybe a little different now, Ryan, because they're not going to get those. They're not going to get Notre Dame, and they're not going to get Ohio. I mean, look, every year, the Saturday after Thanksgiving, what could ESPN for a number of years always kind of rely on? We got a shot to have the Michigan, Ohio State game. Then Fox came into the picture, and they were getting that sometimes. Mm-hmm. But now it's like we're not getting that. What else could they always had to Michigan, Ohio State, or Penn State, Ohio State night game every year. Yep. It's going to be, every year that was going to be a night game, and it was going to have a ton of viewers. That's 2 huge fan bases. That's gone. So that's a big deal. I really do. I really do think it's a big deal. I really do. So it's going to be interesting. I could be wrong, but we'll see. Ed has a super sticker. Thank you very, very much, Ed. I want to throw 2 more out here, Ryan, and then we're going to get going. We have 2 questions from Ladarius. One is about Alabama, which we'll answer.
I don't want to answer
it. You will.
I'm just kidding.
You will. It's up your wheelhouse. And then the other is about Notre Dame. Ladarius asks, Brian and Ryan, of all the Alabama incoming transfers, which one do y'all think will have the biggest impact on them? He predicted the kid from Vanderbilt, Tyler Steen.
Tyler Steen?
I don't. I think it's actually Jermaine Burton.
You think Jermaine Burton? Do you?
I do. You and I disagree on Jermaine Burton's upside. Yeah. But the one thing that I do believe he can be is a number one in that offense. He is a proven player. They have no other proven receivers coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And the worst thing you can do to your redshirt sophomore young quarterback who's going to be replacing a bunch of offensive linemen is have him not have confidence in his wide receivers. You got a veteran guy that at the very least, if he just repeats what he did last year, he's going to be a 1,000-yard receiver because the volume is going to be up so much greater from a target standpoint. He's a good football player. I just don't think he's a great football player.
That's fair.
And I think he's going to be him and Bryce are going to have a really nice connection this year, and the system is going to create some opportunities for him. I think that is important because I don't love their young receivers are good, but they're not like the other guys. And Tyler Harrell is a one-trick pony, in my opinion. He's a speed guy.
Yeah.
I mean, that is it. He had like 17 catches last year.
Yeah.
They need that guy to solidify. Tyler Steen's a nice player, but I don't, it's not like he's not Evan Neal. It's not, you know what I mean? Like, he's not going to do for tackle what Jermaine Burton is going to do to replace. Like Jermaine Burton's not going to be Jamison Williams either, but he's going to look a lot more like Jamison Williams than Tyler Steen's going to look like Evan Neal, in my opinion, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I would rather, look, I think Tyler Steen's needed because you lost the player like an Evan Neal and you didn't have a good starting right tackle last year anyway. So like it's a need for sure. I would almost rather them just bank on a couple of the young guys though. Like why can't I see JC Latham and Tyler and Tommy Brockermeyer play? Like why can't those guys step into the forefront a little bit? Because I either way you're downgrading from Evan Neal to Tyler Steen, right? Like that's a big downgrade. Right. I would say I'm going to be a little inconsistent with this, Brian. So I named Eli Ricks as a overrated player, but I think he's important for this Alabama team because they do not have much talent at the cornerback position coming back. I mean, they have Malachi Moore, who's a pretty nice nickel, but they lost both starting cornerbacks from last year's team. And last year at the end of the season, especially because forget the kid's name that was hurt down the stretch that got drafted.
Joe.
But they're
Are you talking about no? Josh, he didn't get drafted. Yeah,
not Jalen Armour Davis. Yeah. He got hurt, and then down the stretch of the season, like their cornerbacks were just not good. Like Kool-Aid McKinstry has some talent for sure, but Eli Ricks I think comes in and he's easily your best cornerback early on. So I think that is a very big need for them.
Yep, I can see that. I have no trust in him that he's gonna. I just have no trust in him as a player.
That's fair.
And honestly, would I be shocked if that was true? No, because he's talented. It's just I just think he's too inconsistent, and I have some issues with him. And I thought you were going to go a different direction. I thought you were going to bring up Jahmyr Gibbs, but I think Jahmyr Gibbs is a good player. But look, he's a good player. I get that. It's just I think they're turning him into something that he's not. From a perception standpoint, standpoint.
I get that. I think he's going to have a big season, though. I do. It's but
That's
it's one
fine.
of those things.
The production will be fine, but he's not a guy that to me that has proven he can take over a game.
We'll see. I mean, he'll have better players around him now, so it's possible it's a different outcome.
Hold on a second now, because I said something specific. I said he hasn't proven that he can take over a game. Are you gonna tell me he has proven that he can take over a game?
No. I'm saying that I think it'll be different if there's a different.
Sure, but that's not what I said. I said, has he proven that he can take over a game? He has not. And that's my thing. Whereas like Jermaine Burton has played in those big money moments, right? Like I know going into the season that if it's 3rd and 5, even though, again, I don't think he's the guys they've had, but he's going to go make a play because he's already shown he can do that.
Yeah.
Right. And that's my whole thing. But
sure.
Don't get me wrong. I think Jahmyr Gibbs is a very good football player. I mean, he averaged 5.2 yards per carry the last 2 years, which is great. But it's pretty good behind the offensive line he was playing behind the last 2 years at Georgia Tech. Yeah. I just think like there's people talking about like him, Heisman contender and all, and I just don't see that. I don't see that kind of player. I think he's going to be a very productive guy, but production doesn't always equal are you taking over games. That's where I'm coming from.
That's understandable.
Yeah. And also it's Bill O'Brien, right?
That's very true.
So
that's a great point. That's an excellent point. I say he wasn't my pick because I do think he's going to have a big impact, Ladarius. But I will say this: that I mean, there's other talented running backs in that room, right? Like it's not like they have no talent if he's not the guy, right? Like they still have Trey Sanders and Jace McClellan, and they got some other names in there, which is that's why he wasn't my pick. I think that cornerback, you just don't have a ton of other guys to depend on.
Yep. Let's get to this last question here. I believe I don't see any more super chats. Let me see here. Let's make sure we don't have any more coming down the pike that we want to get to. So, yeah, we'll end with this question that is from Ladarius, but is Notre Dame related. He goes, do y'all see a trap game on the schedule this year similar to Cincinnati last year? First of all, I don't view Cincinnati as a trap game. No. Cincinnati was a top 10 team. I don't think they were a trap team. I think that was the equivalent to Cincinnati this year is Ohio State, a really good playoff caliber team that you've got to beat. I think there's two of them. There's Clemson and Ohio State. Mm-hmm. But Ryan, so take the Cincinnati equation out of it. I think there's two potential trap games, and three potential trap games, and two of them they play in back-to-back games. So mine are chronologically North Carolina, BYU, Boston College. Yeah. The one I'm most concerned about losing is Boston College.
Boston College was my pick as well. I know a lot of people, I think, in the chat said BYU at some point. Yeah. I think that BYU is just a little different because, I mean, it's a trap game in the sense that, like, Notre Dame should win that football game, but it's still a team that won 10 games last year, and you're playing, and it's also a Shamrock Series game too, right? So, like, there's kind of that, like, bullseye on there. I think Boston College is one, though, I think for sure, because Boston College usually plays pretty good football against Notre Dame historically. Like, they usually give Notre Dame a good competitive football game. You have, just kind of they're not returning any offensive linemen. So is their offense going to be as good as people think that it could be? I personally do think it can be very good as long as the offensive line holds up, but there are some question marks around the Boston College team. But I think that that's the definition of a trap game is they have a lot of questions, but they could sneak up on you potentially.
Yeah. I think to me as well, I feel for it to be a trap game that you might actually lose. I think the other team I've said this for several years, the true trap games are against teams that can score. You're not going to lose. And I think a perfect example is Toledo last year. Why couldn't Toledo beat Notre Dame? Because they couldn't score enough to get Notre Dame behind where they couldn't recover. When we see these upsets like this, Ryan, it's from teams that can score. And that's why the three I mentioned, and that's why I think BC might be the most dangerous because, I mean, you said it earlier, Zay Flowers is a dude. And our opinions of Phil Dracovic are not, we have not hid them over the last couple of years. And then George Takis is another one. I mean, then there's Jalen Gill. They've got some other receivers can play. It's Garbo, right? The Garbo kid at running back, Garwo. He's coming off a 1,000-yard season. I know there's some issues at offensive line, but they don't play Notre Dame until game 11, week 12. True. So their offensive line should at least be okay by then, at least competent. So, and then it's how can Coach Hafley and the D coordinator kind of get the defense where they can just make some stops. But I think that's why they kind of scare me a little bit is because I think they have, like, North Carolina has enough playmakers with their scheme that they can be a little bit dangerous if you're not ready for them. BYU has some good football players, but BYU would be third on my trap game list because, to your point, Ryan, this is a 10-win football team. Notre Dame's not going to be overlooking.
They were a good team last year, yeah.
Right. And you have a bye week to kind of get your mind right. And so that's kind of where I come from. And so when I look at the BC game, it's also the placement is a challenge. Because, like, you're not going to overlook BYU to get ready for Stanford. You know what I mean? Like, where is what's right before and right after BC? You've got Clemson, then Navy. Big game, triple option. What comes right after the BC game? USC on the road. If USC is good, the BC game will scare the heck out of me. If the USC is not good, then I think Notre Dame will be more ready for BC because then that will be the last big potential stumbling block. But if, like, USC is like 8-9-1 going into the week Notre Dame plays USC, I do get worried that people will be kind of looking past BC to USC. That's the other part. Because a trap game is like you kind of get caught between, to me, whereas, like, North Carolina comes right after Cal and before a bye week. There's a better chance you get their best game. I do think there's a chance you can overlook them, though, because of what they don't have. BYU, similarly, I don't know how much you're going to overlook them. BC, this is the game that concerns me a little bit in that regard.
That's interesting. Yep.
Here's a question I want to have, Ryan, that I want to bring up before we end. So I'm going to throw my own mailbag question out there.
Okay.
And I want to get people's questions in the chat as well. So, Ryan, the two scenarios that I brought up earlier is the possibility that Notre Dame goes to a Fox or an NBC or CBS or all of them as sort of some sort of package deal with the Big Ten. where that looks similar to what they have now at the ACC. Some sort of 4 to 5 game scheduling deal with the Big Ten. I hate the Big Ten. I don't think you're a big fan of the Big Ten. The other option is signing with ESPN. I hate ESPN. You hate ESPN.
Yes.
What would be worse? Which one could you tolerate the most? Signing some sort of deal with Fox or CBS or NBC, or multiples, and then you get your streaming service, but you have to play Big Ten teams, and you're joining the Big Ten for your non-football sports. You're still independent football, but you are now kind of affiliated with the Big Ten. Or would it be going to ESPN either independently or as some sort of let's help build up the ACC? Which one would be worse, or which one would be more tolerable?
More tolerable? I guess I would pick ESPN.
Can't say, yeah, okay.
I guess I would pick ESPN. I mean, like you said with the Big Ten stuff, I just don't think that I don't think that the values align well in that one, and I don't want to I don't know if you're handicapping the rest of your sports by making them play in the Big Ten schedule, but I don't know. I just feel like you're forcing others into the situation, right? ESPN, you're a little more free to do what you want, but I'm also backing ESPN, which makes it so. Is there not a right answer to this question? I don't think there's a right answer, but I guess I'll go with Big Ten. I guess I'll go with ESPN.
There's no happy answer.
No.
And I think Michael nails it. I hate ESPN, but I hate the Big Ten more.
That's fair.
I do.
And that's
honestly,
kind of where I was coming from, honestly. Yeah.
Because as much as I despise ESPN, for Notre Dame, it would be good for them because then they'd be part of the hype train.
True. It would be good for the perception and everything, right? Yeah.
The other part is as long as you still have your partnership with the ACC, or here's the other thing, the SEC becomes a little bit more amenable to scheduling Notre Dame because of it, and you still have that Mid-Atlantic Southeastern presence, which is important. My biggest fear for Notre Dame football, and I don't think it handicaps the other sports because I feel like it plays into where those other sports tend to recruit more. I think for football, however, I think being a part of the Big Ten would drag them down a little bit because, as we've explained before, we need to rehash it again. Notre Dame becoming just another Midwestern school does nothing for Notre Dame. It's just a money grab. The only reason to join the Big Ten is, honestly, in my opinion, would just be a money grab. That's it.
Yeah.
And, at least where you're grabbing money by signing the ESPN, assuming you believe that they are, on good enough foundation to last for the length of your contract. But if that's true, then I think at the very least, you're still maintaining your national reach from a perception, influence, recruiting standpoint.
That's
and
fair.
I think that would be the reason. As much as I despise both, it's like that is why I land on ESPN.
And
which even I'm saying it just makes me like,
I know. But that's why I also went there when I said the freedom, right? That's why. I think that if you align the other way, then you are. I mean, the whole big thing about being independent is that you want to have the national presence, right? You want to be able to carry yourself that way. And if you throw your hat basically into the ring with the Big Ten, it's you're not a national presence as much anymore. You're becoming a regionalized presence, which we were talking about dominating the Midwest in recruiting, right? That's big, but also we're not just going to dominate the Midwest for recruits. We're going to dominate the Midwest as a power.
Right. So when you go down south, you're the Midwestern. Right. Exactly. That's a great clarification, or not clarification, but explanation on when we talk about dominating the Midwest. It's a perception standpoint. So when you go down to Texas against Ohio State, you win those battles. When you go down to Georgia and Florida and Louisiana and other states to, DC, Maryland to battle Ohio State for the next Jason Moore, you're the big time school that he can't turn down, not Ohio State. And that's 100%. What we refer to. But it's not about, so we can get the kids from Chicago or the kids from Pennsylvania or whatever, right? That's not what it refers to. So it's a really good.
That's expected. But that limits the reach if that's just kind of your vision. Yep, 100%.
Yep, absolutely. Well, that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It was a very, very fun show, long show. And even though today's show felt longer, Ryan, even though it wasn't as long as yesterday's show was, But I think that's why I kind of like the multiple topics, in the earlier
Agreed.
part. It was a lot of fun yesterday. So, man, who knows? We may do more of that moving forward. But really good discussion on the defense today, Ryan. This is a group that has got a chance to be really, really good this year. It's going to be fun to see how it plays out. And it's going to be a fun season overall. So we'll be back tomorrow at 1 o'clock for our another show. Tonight, 6 p.m. Eastern. Make sure that you don't miss out on the IB Nation Sports Talk Show with Sean Stiers and Vince. Literally, Sean just texted me and he said tonight they're going to have sound bites from Coach Freeman, Coach Reese, and Coach Golden, and more camp combos. So you're definitely going to want to check that out on the IB Nation Sports Talk, which is a part of Irish Breakdown's channel. We also are going to be announcing, hopefully in the next 24 to 48 hours, we have signed our first host for a show on our new CFB Nation channel. I'm very excited to announce that. We have signed a deal. It's all now pen to paper, and we're now good to go. Hypothetically pen to paper. It's all digital now, but you get the point that I'm making. So I'm very excited about that, and we're excited to get that rocking and rolling. It's going to be a recruiting show. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So anyway, for Ryan, I'm Brian. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We will talk to you again very soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.